There is a quiet contradiction inside the human body. The less you do, the more drained you can feel. Not from effort, not from movement, but from stillness itself. In earlier environments, energy was spent to solve immediate problems, finding warmth, food, safety and rest followed naturally. But in the modern world, the body often remains alert without resolution, holding a low, continuous tension with nowhere to go. It is not exhaustion from action, but from something unresolved, something incomplete. Why would a body designed to conserve energy begin to feel depleted in the absence of effort? And why does your body feel drained even when you do nothing? There is a quiet moment many people recognize but rarely question, when the body feels heavy without having done anything that would normally justify that weight, when the muscles are not sore, the breath is not shortened, and yet there is a subtle sense of depletion that seems to come from somewhere deeper than movement or effort, a kind of internal dimming that does not match the visible absence of activity. In earlier stages of human existence, this feeling would have been difficult to encounter in the same way, because stillness itself was rarely prolonged without purpose, and when it did occur, it usually followed a completed action such as gathering food, building shelter, or moving across terrain. Each of these actions, forming a closed loop where effort began, reached a clear end and allowed the body to shift into recovery. The human body, shaped over long periods of time in environments that required continuous interaction with physical surroundings, learned to associate energy expenditure with resolution, not with suspension. When energy was used, it led somewhere, and when the action ended, the body could recognize that end. But in the present moment, the structure of daily experience often removes that sense of completion, leaving the body in a condition that is physically inactive, yet internally unresolved. This creates a form of tension that is difficult to locate because it does not belong to the muscles or to any single organ, but rather to the coordination between systems that evolved to operate in a different rhythm. If we look back to the earliest human environments, where survival depended on responding directly to immediate conditions, we can begin to see how closely linked action and relief once were. A drop in temperature would lead to movement toward warmth, hunger would lead to searching and eating, darkness would bring a natural slowing of activity, and each of these cycles contained a beginning and an end that the body could register without ambiguity. The absence of such cycles in modern conditions does not remove the signals themselves, but it changes what happens to them. Signals may arise without being fully acted upon, or they may persist beyond the point where an action could resolve them, creating a kind of internal echo that remains active even in stillness. Over time, this pattern can make stillness itself feel incomplete, as if the body is waiting for something that never quite arrives. The sensation of being drained, then, begins to shift away from the idea of energy lost through work, and toward the idea of energy held in a state that has not been released. This is not a dramatic or sudden process, but a gradual accumulation of small mismatches between what the body prepares for and what it is allowed to complete. Even in a single day, moments of inactivity are often surrounded by low levels of anticipation, attention, or unresolved intention, each one subtle on its own, but together forming a continuous background that the body does not easily turn off. When we consider the long history of human adaptation, it becomes clearer that the body is not only responsive to physical effort, but also to patterns of expectation and closure that once had clear boundaries in the natural world. Without those boundaries, the experience of rest becomes less defined, and the absence of movement no longer guarantees the presence of recovery. This is where the paradox begins to take shape, not as a contradiction in logic, but as a shift in conditions, where the body continues to operate according to patterns formed in earlier environments, even as the environment itself no longer provides the same structure for those patterns to complete themselves. In this way, the feeling of being drained without doing anything is not entirely without cause, but it is also not caused in the way we might first assume, because it does not originate in visible effort, but in the quiet persistence of processes that remain active beneath the surface, waiting for a resolution that has become less certain in the conditions of modern life. The question, then, is not simply why the body feels tired, but what kind of tiredness this actually is, and whether it belongs to the absence of action or to something that continues even when action has stopped. This distinction, though subtle, begins to open a different way of looking at fatigue, one that does not measure it only by what has been done, but also by what has not been allowed to finish. This is the beginning of understanding how stillness itself can carry a cost that is not immediately visible, but slowly felt over time. If this quiet form of tiredness does not come from visible effort, then it becomes necessary to look more closely at what the body is actually doing during moments that appear empty from the outside. Because the absence of movement does not mean the absence of activity, and in many cases, the systems responsible for maintaining awareness, balance, and readiness remain gently active even when the body is still. This background activity is not a flaw or a mistake, but a continuation of patterns that were once essential for survival in environments where stillness did not guarantee safety, and where remaining attentive, even without immediate movement, could make the difference between noticing a change and missing it. In those earlier conditions, however, this state of quiet alertness was usually brief and followed by a clear outcome, either a return to full rest or a transition into action, allowing the body to complete the cycle it had begun. What changes in the present is not the existence of this alertness, but its duration and its lack of resolution, as it becomes extended across periods of time that no longer contain a clear signal for ending. When the body remains in this low-level state without moving toward completion, it begins to carry a subtle cost. Not because the energy expenditure is large, but because it is continuous and without clear boundaries. Over hours and days, this continuity can create a feeling that is difficult to trace back to any single moment, a sense that energy is being used without a visible result. If we return again to the earlier human context, where daily life was structured around direct interaction with the environment, we can see how rarely such open-ended states would have persisted. A sound in the distance would either be investigated or dismissed. A change in light would lead to adjustment in behavior, and even uncertainty would tend to resolve into some form of action or withdrawal. The body, in that setting, was rarely left waiting without direction. In contrast, modern conditions often generate signals that do not lead to immediate action, but also do not disappear, remaining present in a softened form that keeps the system engaged. This engagement is not intense enough to feel like stress in the usual sense, but it is also not quiet enough to allow full recovery, placing the body in a narrow space between readiness and rest. Within this space, energy is not released through movement, nor conserved through true stillness, but held in a kind of suspended use that continues in the background. Over time, this can reshape how stillness itself is experienced, turning what was once a clear state of recovery into something more ambiguous, where the body does not fully recognize that it is safe to reduce its internal activity. The feeling of being drained begins to emerge not as a response to exertion, but as a response to this prolonged ambiguity, where the systems that prepare the body for action remain partially active without ever completing their role. This does not require dramatic events or strong emotions, but can arise from small, repeated patterns that never quite reach a point of closure. Even a simple moment of sitting quietly can contain layers of subtle engagement, shifts in attention, low-level monitoring, and incomplete transitions that the body continues to process beneath awareness. When these layers accumulate, they create a form of fatigue that is not easily relieved by doing less, because it is not caused by doing too much, in the usual sense, but by the absence of clear endings that would allow the body to change states. Looking at the long arc of human adaptation, it becomes more understandable that the body is not designed to remain indefinitely in this intermediate condition, and that when it does, it begins to express that mismatch through sensations that feel like depletion. The question then deepens slightly, moving from the simple observation of tiredness toward the structure that supports or prevents true rest, and whether the modern pattern of extended, unresolved alertness is quietly shaping the way energy is felt, even in the absence of visible activity. If this state of quiet alertness continues without resolution, the body gradually loses the ability to clearly distinguish between moments that require readiness and moments that allow true rest. And this blurring of states becomes one of the more subtle ways in which energy begins to feel consistently low, even in the absence of effort. The human body relies not only on how much energy is used, but on how clearly different phases of activity are separated from one another, because the transition from engagement to recovery is where restoration takes place. In earlier human environments, These transitions were often marked by external changes that were difficult to ignore: the setting of the sun, the drop in temperature, the completion of a task, or the movement of a group from one place to another, each of these acting as a signal that one phase had ended and another had begun. These signals did not require conscious interpretation, as they were embedded in the rhythm of the environment itself, allowing the body to shift states with a kind of natural timing that did not need to be managed or maintained internally. When those external markers become less distinct or are replaced by conditions that do not change in the same way, the responsibility for managing these transitions moves inward, and the body must rely more heavily on internal cues that are often less precise. This shift does not happen all at once, but gradually alters how the body organizes its own activity, making it more difficult to fully exit a state of low-level engagement. Over time, the boundaries between action and rest become less defined, and instead of moving cleanly from one to the other, the body remains in a mixed condition where elements of both are present at the same time. In this mixed state, the systems that would normally power down during rest continue to operate at a reduced but persistent level, while the systems responsible for recovery do not fully activate, creating a situation where neither state is complete. From the perspective of energy, this is not efficient, because it prevents the body from fully conserving or fully using its resources, keeping it instead in a prolonged middle ground where small amounts of energy are continuously spent without leading to restoration. If we again consider the early human context, where the day was structured around cycles of movement and pause that were closely tied to environmental conditions, it becomes clear that this middle ground would have been relatively rare and short-lived. The body either needed to act or could afford to rest, and the signals guiding those decisions were immediate and grounded in physical reality. In contrast, the modern pattern often allows for extended periods where the body is neither fully required to act nor clearly allowed to disengage, and this ambiguity becomes one of the underlying sources of the drained feeling that emerges over time. The sensation is not sharp or easily traced, but diffuse and persistent, building slowly as the body continues to operate without reaching the endpoints it expects. This helps explain why simply reducing activity does not always lead to a sense of recovery, because the issue is not only the amount of movement, but the absence of clear transitions that would allow the body to reorganize its internal processes. The longer this pattern continues, the more the body adapts to it, not by resolving it, but by normalizing a state of partial engagement that carries a quiet, ongoing cost. This cost is not dramatic enough to demand immediate attention, but it is steady enough to shape how energy is experienced throughout the day, making stillness feel less like rest and more like a continuation of something unfinished. In this way, the original paradox begins to settle into a more structured understanding, where the feeling of being drained without doing anything is not an isolated occurrence, but a reflection of how the body is navigating conditions that no longer provide the clear signals it once relied on. The question remains open, but it now points toward a deeper layer, not only asking why the body feels this way, but how the absence of clear beginnings and endings has quietly reshaped the experience of rest itself. The body does not merely need rest after effort, it also needs the sense that something has been completed. And this older requirement is easy to miss because modern language often treats fatigue as if it were only a matter of fuel, as though the body were a container that becomes empty through action and full again through inactivity. But the human organism was not shaped in conditions where inactivity alone signaled safety or restoration. For most of human existence, recovery came after some form of resolution, after warmth had been found, after water had been reached, after a group had settled for the night, after a threat had passed far enough to no longer demand attention. In that older pattern, rest was not simply the absence of movement, it was the biological recognition that a pressing demand had ended, at least for a time. This distinction matters because the body responds not only to what it does, but to whether what it is prepared for has been brought to a close. In earlier human settings, many demands were concrete and visible. A person felt cold and moved closer to fire or shelter. A person felt hunger and joined the work of searching, gathering, preparing, or sharing food. A person noticed danger and either fled, hid, watched carefully, or remained close to others until the risk subsided. The surrounding world imposed real pressure, but it also provided clear outcomes. The environment itself told the body when a cycle had ended. In such a world, Effort and closure were closely linked, and the body could shift out of vigilance because the reason for vigilance had changed in a direct and observable way. This does not mean life was simple or easy. It means the signals reaching the body usually belong to situations that could move towards some kind of conclusion. The modern condition often breaks that older relationship. The body can be stirred without being allowed to finish what it has been stirred for. A person may sit still for hours while attention remains gently pulled, held, interrupted, and redirected, never strongly enough to create visible struggle, but often enough to prevent full disengagement. In this setting, the body keeps preparing in small ways. It maintains orientation, readiness, anticipation, and low-level control, yet the action that would once have completed the cycle either does not happen or does not fully resolve what the body has registered. This creates a form of suspension. The system has been asked to begin but not clearly permitted to end. Looking back toward the earliest human environments helps clarify why this matters. For a body shaped across long stretches of time in landscapes of changing light, unstable weather, movement on foot, and close attention to immediate surroundings, energy management depended on alternating states that were more distinct than they often are now. There was exertion, there was pause, there was watchfulness, there was relief. These were not perfect categories, but they were often easier for the body to separate because they were anchored in real transitions in the world outside the skin. In contrast, modern life can produce an unusual situation in which the body receives many beginnings and too few endings. Signals arise, attention turns, readiness increases slightly, but nothing fully closes. This is one reason stillness can feel deceptively costly. From the outside, little seems to be happening. From the inside, however, the body may be carrying unfinished adjustments, unresolved preparations, and a low but steady demand to remain available. The result is not the exhaustion of hard labor, but something quieter and more difficult to name. It is the fatigue of suspension, the fatigue of being kept in a state that is neither full action nor full release. This helps explain why doing less does not always bring immediate restoration. The body is not only waiting for an activity, it is waiting for a kind of internal permission that earlier environments often supplied more naturally through completed cycles. Without that permission, rest becomes shallower than it appears, and the body may continue to feel drained not because it has done too much, but because it has been held too long in a condition that does not resolve. Seen this way, tiredness begins to look less like a simple shortage of energy and more like the cost of a body built for closure living inside patterns that rarely provide it. A body shaped by long histories of movement through uncertain environments does not respond well to open loops, because its deeper systems were formed in settings where signals usually led towards some kind of change in the world. A sound in the dark asked for listening, then either proved harmless or led to action. A lack of food led towards searching, then eating, then a temporary easing of the demand. Cold led toward fire, covering, shelter, or closeness to others. Even when life was harsh, the pressures placed on the body were often tied to realities that could shift. And because they could shift, the body could also change state with them. This older pattern is important because it suggests that human energy was never managed only by quantity, but also by sequence. The body prepared, acted, adjusted, and then, if conditions allowed, stood down. What becomes unusual in many modern conditions is that preparation often continues while resolution remains weak, delayed, or absent. The body begins processes that once would have moved toward completion, yet the surrounding situation does not provide the clear ending those processes expect. This does not need to happen through dramatic stress. It can arise through prolonged uncertainty that never becomes urgent enough to demand action and never becomes quiet enough to disappear. In that middle zone, the body stays engaged in a subtle way. Muscles may remain mostly relaxed, but attention continues to orient. Breathing may remain calm, but the deeper organization of the system does not fully settle. The person may appear to be resting, yet the body is still holding itself in readiness for something undefined. Looking back toward early human life makes this easier to understand. For people living close to weather, landscape, seasonal change, group movement, and the immediate requirements of finding food and protection, the body was rarely asked to sustain readiness without context. The surrounding world gave direct reasons for vigilance and equally direct reasons for releasing it. The edge of evening changed what could be seen. A shared camp changed proximity and safety. Physical tiredness followed physical work. Hunger followed expenditure and led towards some attempt at resolution. These were not gentle lives, but they were often biologically legible. Hunger. The body could read the world around it and organize its energy accordingly. In the present, much of that legibility has weakened. Many signals now remain abstract, delayed, or incomplete, and the body, which still operates through older patterns of response, continues to prepare without receiving the closure that would once have followed. The result is not always intense distress. More often it is a thin, persistent tension that becomes part of the background of daily life. Because it is mild, it is easy to underestimate. Because it is continuous, it becomes expensive. A small demand repeated without ending can shape energy more deeply than a larger effort that reaches completion. This helps explain why people sometimes feel unexpectedly depleted after days that seemed physically easy. The problem is not that the body has mistaken rest for work. The problem is that it does not fully recognize the moment as rest at all. It recognizes partial pause, interrupted pause, available pause, but not the fuller biological state that comes when conditions signal, clearly and repeatedly, that nothing more is required for now. From an evolutionary point of view, this makes sense. A body that relaxed too early in unstable settings would have carried real risk. It is safer, in that older logic, to remain somewhat prepared until the world has changed enough to justify release. But when the world no longer provides clear endings, that cautious wisdom can become a quiet burden. The body remains competent, but tired. It remains still, but not restored. It remains inactive on the outside while continuing low, unfinished work within. This is why doing nothing can feel strangely costly. The body is not simply measuring motion, it is measuring whether a cycle has closed. When closure is missing, even stillness can feel incomplete, and incompleteness, held hour after hour, becomes one of the hidden ways energy drains away. Seen from this angle, tiredness is no longer just a question of what has been spent. It is also a question of what has never been allowed to finish, and of how a body built for resolved realities now lives among conditions that keep asking it to begin without ever quite letting it end. When the body is repeatedly drawn into beginnings that do not arrive at a clear end, it slowly starts to treat incompletion as normal, and this may be one of the quietest reasons a person can feel worn down without being able to point to a single cause. Human physiology is often described in terms of reaction, but it may be just as important to think in terms of resolution, because the body does not only need to detect change, it also needs to recognize when a demand has passed enough for its internal balance to shift. In much of earlier human life, this recognition was supported by the world itself. Light changed in visible ways. Cold deepened or softened in ways the skin could read. Distances were crossed by walking, not by abstraction. Food was not an idea held in the mind for hours without consequence, but something found, missed, carried, prepared, and shared. Threats were often uncertain, but they belonged to landscapes, sounds, weather, animals, other groups, and bodily states that produced more direct outcomes than many modern pressures do. The body could remain alert, but it was usually alert in relation to something that would either intensify, fade, or force action. That pattern mattered. It meant the system was not designed for endless suspension, but for cycles in which readiness eventually became movement, and movement eventually became release. The present condition often interrupts that older sequence. A person may wake already carrying a faint sense of demand before anything visible has happened. Attention begins organizing itself early, preparing for tasks, possibilities, unfinished concerns, and uncertain obligations. Yet many of these never become concrete enough for decisive action, and they also do not disappear. The body is left inhabiting a string of partial activations, each one too small to seem serious, but together large enough to shape the day. This does not always feel like alarm. More often it feels like a background thinning of energy, a sense that something inside has remained switched on for too long. Returning to the deeper human past helps make this less mysterious. For bodies formed across long eras of close dependence on external conditions, conservation was not the same as immobility. A person sitting near shelter at dusk after travel, gathering, tool work, or social coordination was not merely doing nothing. The day had moved through recognizable stages. The environment had narrowed its demands. The the body could feel where it was in time. In many modern settings, that temporal clarity weakens. The day can remain open in a biological sense long after the sun has shifted. Activity can stop externally while expectation continues internally. The body, which once relied on marked transitions in landscape, light, group rhythm, and task completion, now has fewer trustworthy endings to guide its descent into restoration. This is why the absence of physical labor is not enough to guarantee recovery. Recovery depends on whether internal systems believe that readiness can safely recede. If that belief never becomes stable, then rest remains shallow, even inside stillness. Over long periods, the body may begin to live in a state of partial commitment, never fully mobilized, never fully released. That state has a cost precisely because it is mild. A sharp demand often forces resolution one way or another. A mild, unresolved demand can continue indefinitely. It asks for small adjustments in breathing, posture, attention, muscular tone, and internal timing, none dramatic on its own, all tiring in accumulation. This helps explain why a person can spend a day with little visible effort and still feel as though something has quietly drained away. What has drained away is not simply fuel in the mechanical sense. It is the capacity that depends on completed cycles, on recognizable endings, on the body's ability to say, however briefly, that for now nothing more must be held open. Seen from this angle, the modern feeling of being exhausted by apparently empty days is not a contradiction at all. It is the understandable expression of a body built in worlds of clearer sequence now living in worlds that prolong uncertainty and thin out closure. The deeper paradox is that the body may be working hardest when its work can no longer be seen, because the labor is shifted inward, into the constant management of states that begin but do not resolve, and into the quiet effort of staying prepared inside a life that rarely tells the organism, in the old unmistakable way, that it may finally stand down. Much of the tiredness people describe in quiet modern life does not come from moments of obvious strain, but from a softer condition that can remain present for long stretches without demanding notice, a condition that is neither panic nor calm, neither crisis nor recovery, but something thinner and more persistent. It is a low-grade state of alertness, so familiar that it can disappear into the background of ordinary experience. The body is not preparing for immediate escape, yet it is not fully relinquishing its readiness either. This matters because human physiology was not shaped only for dramatic danger. It was also shaped for the careful monitoring of changing conditions, for small adjustments in response to uncertain weather, shifting sounds, unfamiliar movement at a distance, changes in group behavior, and the many quiet signs that something in the environment might require attention. In earlier human settings, this kind of alertness had practical value, but it was usually attached to concrete surroundings that changed in visible ways. A distant sound either came closer or faded. Light strengthened or disappeared. A camp settled into night. A path opened or narrowed. A body moving through those landscapes could stay attentive without becoming permanently suspended, because the world itself kept providing updates. The environment moved, and in moving, it told the body when to increase its readiness, when to act, and when to let go. What becomes unusual in the present is that the body can remain gently alert while the conditions around it fail to offer those same clear transitions. The signal to stay available remains, but the signal to fully release often weakens. This creates a form of expenditure that is easy to underestimate because it is not intense. It does not feel like a burst of stress. It feels more like a faint hum beneath the surface, a quiet background state in which attention never fully sits down. The body continues to monitor, to prepare, to hold slight tension in systems that were not meant to stay activated without interruption. Over the course of a day, this does not always register as distress. More often, it registers as heaviness, mental dimness, irritability without clear cause, or the peculiar sensation of being tired without having truly exerted oneself. To understand why this matters, it helps to return again to the beginning of the human story, not to romanticize earlier life, but to notice the structure within which the body first learned to regulate itself. Early human beings lived inside environments that demanded vigilance, but that vigilance was usually tied to sensory reality. The ground underfoot, the air, the distance between bodies, the movement of animals, the presence or absence of fire. All of these gave the nervous system information it could use. Even uncertainty belonged to a world that eventually revealed itself. A sound became something or nothing. Hunger became eating or continued searching. Darkness became sleep or watchfulness by turns. These were difficult conditions, but they were often biologically legible. The body did not need to remain indefinitely in a state of diffuse anticipation because the environment kept moving toward outcomes. In contrast, a low-level alertness that does not resolve can quietly stretch across hours, then days, not because the body is malfunctioning, but because it is continuing to do what it was built to do under conditions that no longer provide closure. This is where the cost begins. A brief alert state can be useful. A constant mild alert state becomes expensive precisely because it asks for many small acts of internal management at once. Breathing may remain slightly adjusted. Muscles may never fully soften. Attention may keep scanning inward and outward. Timing within the body may remain subtly keyed toward readiness rather than repair. None of this has the drama of visible effort, yet together it forms a continuous demand. The body pays for this demand not through obvious collapse, but through gradual depletion, through the slow erosion of the feeling that rest has actually occurred. This is why an apparently easy day can still leave a person feeling unrenewed. The issue is not only what was done, but what state the body remained in while doing very little. When alertness becomes mild enough to seem normal, it also becomes difficult to interrupt. It is no longer experienced as an event, it becomes an atmosphere. And once it becomes an atmosphere, the body can spend long periods living inside it, carrying a small but steady burden that earlier environments would more often have brought to some kind of end. In that sense, being drained may begin not with major effort, but with the long, quiet cost of a body that never receives a clear enough signal that it can stop listening so closely. A body can endure brief moments of heightened readiness with remarkable efficiency, but it is less well suited to carrying a diluted form of readiness across long stretches of ordinary time, because the problem is no longer intensity but duration. A short episode of clear demand often has a beginning, a peak, and an ending. The body understands that sequence. It prepares, mobilizes, and then, if conditions permit, withdraws from that state. What becomes more difficult is a condition in which no single moment is strong enough to justify full mobilization, yet the background environment continues to suggest that attention should not completely relax. This creates a narrow band of living in which the body remains partly engaged for reasons that are real enough to be felt, but too diffuse to be resolved. The resulting fatigue is rarely dramatic. It gathers quietly, almost invisibly, through repetition. A person wakes or sits or moves through a room, and nothing appears wrong, yet the organism continues to hold itself just above full ease, as if waiting for a clearer signal that never quite comes. Looking back toward earlier human life helps explain why such a state can be costly. For most of human existence, mild alertness still belonged to an environment full of concrete transitions. The morning chill became daylight warmth. Animal sounds either approached, scattered, or ceased. The movement of companions gave information about direction, safety, and next steps. Work done with the hands left visible results in tools, shelter, fire, carried food, or prepared space. Even uncertainty had edges. It came attached to specific conditions that the senses could follow. Because the world itself kept changing in readable ways, the body did not need to hold open the same low, indefinite readiness for endless periods. It could remain attentive, but that attentiveness was often guided by surroundings that eventually clarified what mattered and what did not. In contrast, a modern low-level alert state can continue without those clarifying transitions, and that changes the character of fatigue itself. The body may remain slightly organized around possible demand rather than present safety. This does not necessarily produce racing thoughts or visible tension. It can be much quieter than that. It can feel like a subtle inability to settle completely into a chair, into silence, into an evening, or even into the sensation of having finished a day. Something inside continues to monitor, to hold, to wait. The body may appear inactive while still performing countless small acts of regulation. Muscles maintain tiny degrees of tone. Breathing patterns remain a little less loose than they would in full restoration. Attention keeps shifting, not urgently, but persistently. the internal timing of the organism stays closer to readiness than to deep release. Over hours, these small adjustments accumulate. None of them alone seems heavy enough to explain exhaustion, but together they create a steady outflow of energy that the person experiences not as strain, but as dull depletion. This helps explain why people sometimes feel tired in a way that rest does not immediately solve. The body has not simply been overworked, it has been kept available. Availability is costly when it persists too long, because it blocks the deeper descent into recovery that depends on a stronger sense of closure. Returning again to the early human setting makes the contrast clearer. A group settling near shelter at the end of light, after walking, gathering, tending fire, or watching one another's movements, inhabited a world in which environmental signals helped sort the body into recognizable states. The day's tasks may have been difficult, but dusk was dusk, cold was cold, and darkness changed behavior in obvious ways. The body could feel where it stood in relation to the world around it. In many modern conditions, that relationship becomes less distinct. The body receives fragments of demand without a full scene around them, pieces of anticipation without the older environmental rhythm that once helped contain them. As a result, low-level alertness can become not an event, but a habitat. When it becomes a habitat, the person may stop noticing it as a separate state at all. It simply becomes the air inside experience. And once it becomes ordinary, it can shape energy more powerfully than a sharp temporary challenge, because the body never gets the unmistakable message that the need to remain available has ended for now. This is why the drained feeling can be so confusing. It does not always follow effort. Sometimes it follows the quiet labor of remaining slightly prepared all day long. A labor made harder by the fact that it leaves so little visible evidence behind. When this gentle state of readiness continues day after day, the body begins to reorganize around it, not as a temporary adjustment, but as a new baseline that slowly changes how energy is felt and used. This shift is difficult to notice because it does not arrive suddenly, and it does not announce itself with clear signals. Instead, it unfolds through small changes in how easily the body can settle, how deeply it can rest, and how quickly it can return to a state of ease once a moment of attention has passed. Over time, the system becomes less familiar with complete release, and more accustomed to carrying a thin layer of engagement even during periods that would once have allowed full recovery. In earlier human environments, this kind of long-term adjustment was less likely to occur in the same way, because the structure of daily life continued to guide the body back toward clearer distinctions between states. A period of movement across land, the gathering of materials, the tending of fire, the preparation of food, and the shared presence of a group all contributed to cycles that were not only repeated, but completed. Each cycle contained signals that helped the body recognize when to maintain readiness and when to relinquish it. These signals did not depend on internal interpretation alone. They were embedded in the surroundings, in light, temperature, distance, and the visible outcomes of action. Because of this, even a body capable of sustained vigilance was regularly brought back into a state where vigilance could safely recede. The modern pattern often lacks that repeated return. The body may enter low-level alertness many times throughout a day, but the pathways out of that state are less defined. The environment does not always confirm that the moment has passed in a way that the organism can easily trust. As a result, the body learns, gradually, to remain slightly engaged as a default. This default does not feel like stress in the conventional sense. It feels normal. That is what makes it difficult to recognize as a source of fatigue. Yet the cost remains. A body that does not fully stand down also does not fully restore. Energy is replenished in layers, and the deeper layers require conditions in which readiness is not merely reduced, but truly released. Without those conditions, recovery becomes partial. It may be enough to continue functioning, but not enough to create a clear sense of renewal. Looking again toward the origins of human adaptation, it becomes easier to see why this matters. The human organism developed within rhythms that were shaped by the external world, not by continuous internal management. The body did not need to decide at every moment whether it was safe to rest. It responded to patterns that were repeated across days and seasons, patterns that created a kind of shared timing between the organism and its environment. When that shared timing weakens, the burden of regulation shifts inward, and the body must rely more heavily on its own ongoing activity to maintain balance. This increases the amount of quiet work that occurs beneath awareness. It is not intense work, but it is constant. The system keeps adjusting, monitoring, preparing, and holding itself in a state that is never fully resolved. This is where the feeling of being drained can become most confusing, because it does not correspond to any single demand that can be identified and removed. It arises from the accumulation of many small unresolved states that have become continuous. Over long periods, this continuity reshapes the experience of rest itself. Stillness no longer guarantees recovery. Silence no longer guarantees calm. Even sleep may feel less restorative when the body has spent the day in partial engagement that never fully released. The paradox that began with a simple observation now deepens into a more structural condition. The body is not failing to conserve energy. It is conserving in some ways while spending in others, guided by patterns that were once aligned with the world outside and are now less clearly anchored. The result is a quiet imbalance that does not appear as a sharp problem, but as a gradual thinning of energy across time. Understanding this does not resolve the feeling immediately, but it begins to clarify that the experience of being drained without doing anything is not without structure. It reflects a body that has adapted, patiently and persistently, to a state of mild, ongoing readiness, and in doing so has moved further away from the clear endings that once allowed it to fully let go. One of the stranger features of the human body is that it can spend energy preparing for action even when no action ever arrives. And this becomes especially important when trying to understand why a person may feel drained during a day that appears physically light from the outside. Energy is often imagined as something used mainly by visible movement, by walking, lifting, carrying, working, or enduring measurable effort. Yet the body does not wait for motion before it begins to organize itself. It prepares in advance. It adjusts posture, maintains orientation, regulates attention, coordinates breathing, balances internal systems, and keeps multiple processes ready for possible change. In earlier human environments, this preparatory work usually made sense because movement and response were closely tied to immediate conditions. A shift in weather, a sound nearby, the need to follow others, the search for water, the handling of tools, the tending of fire, all required the body to become ready before large movement occurred. But in those settings, preparation was often followed by something concrete. The body gathered itself and then moved, or the signal faded and the body relaxed. The sequence was legible. In the present, the first half of that sequence often remains, while the second half weakens. The body prepares, but does not arrive at the same kind of completion. This creates a mismatch between internal expenditure and external behavior. And that mismatch may be one of the quiet reasons energy feels low, even when effort seems absent. Looking back toward the earliest human conditions helps clarify why this matters. Human beings did not evolve in settings where long stretches of stillness were paired with endless minor demands that never became physical outcomes. The body learned to budget energy within a world of direct exchanges. Hunger led towards searching, cold led toward shelter, covering, or closeness. Uncertainty led toward watching, moving, or waiting in a specific place until something changed. Even in pause, the pause usually belonged to a larger pattern that would become visible in the environment. The body could feel how its preparation connected to the world outside it. That connection allowed energy use to make sense. When internal readiness and external action are aligned, the expenditure, even if tiring, has a direction. What becomes exhausting is not only effort itself, but effort without direction, preparation without discharge, mobilization without outcome. In modern life, this can happen in very quiet ways. The body may remain seated, but subtle muscular support continues. The person may not travel anywhere, but the nervous system keeps adjusting to small cues, interruptions, anticipations, and unfinished shifts in attention. The lungs continue to match breathing to inner states that are not fully settled. The brain coordinates possibilities, expectations, and withheld responses. None of this looks like labor, yet none of it is free. The body is still spending. It is spending in a form that is harder to see because the expenditure is dispersed across systems rather than concentrated in obvious movement. This makes the resulting fatigue confusing. People often expect tiredness to follow visible output, and when it does not, they may assume the feeling is exaggerated or misplaced. But from the body's perspective, the cost can be real even when the motion is small. The deeper issue is that energy is not only consumed by action, it is also consumed by readiness, especially when readiness becomes prolonged and cannot resolve itself through the kind of direct engagement older environments once provided. Returning again to human beginnings makes this easier to understand. A body crossing uneven ground, carrying materials, listening for changes in the landscape, or preparing a safe place at dusk was using energy in ways that join perception, anticipation, and movement together. The whole organism worked as one sequence. In contrast, many modern situations divide these elements apart. Perception stays active, anticipation stays active, but movement is reduced, delayed, or unnecessary. The result is a body that continues to mobilize small amounts of energy internally while lacking the external completion that would once have allowed that mobilization to resolve. Over time, this creates a peculiar form of depletion. The person feels as though energy has leaked away, not through effort that can be remembered clearly, but through a steady background expenditure that never found an outlet. This is why doing nothing can feel so unexpectedly costly. The body is not truly doing nothing. It is often holding itself in a prepared state that belongs to older survival logic, while living inside conditions that do not let that logic complete its natural course. The mismatch is subtle, but its consequences are not. It changes how stillness feels, how rest functions, and how easily a person can mistake internal work for emptiness, when in fact, the body has been quietly spending all along. The human body was not built to separate preparation from movement for very long, because in the deeper conditions of human history, readiness was usually tied to action that followed soon enough for the body to understand why it had gathered its resources in the first place. A change in wind, the scent of rain, the sound of animals shifting in brush, the approach of darkness, the movement of others in a small group, all of these could make the body prepare before anything large had happened. But preparation in those settings was part of a sequence that remained grounded in the physical world. The body adjusted itself because something real was likely to follow, and when that next step arrived, the stored readiness could be used, spent, and then eventually released. What becomes unusual in modern conditions is not that the body prepares, but that it often prepares in fragments, over and over, without entering the kind of full movement that would complete the cycle. This is where energy begins to feel as though it disappears without visible cause. The body is still organizing itself around possible demand, yet the outward life of the person may remain almost unchanged. That gap between internal mobilization and external expression is one of the quiet mismatches that can make a day of little obvious effort feel strangely draining. When seen from a distance, the person may appear inactive, yet inside, countless small adjustments continue. Posture is held and recalibrated. Attention shifts and returns. Breathing subtly follows expectation rather than deep ease. The body remains available for response, even if no response is required in the end. None of these individual acts are dramatic. That is precisely why they are so easy to overlook. But taken together, they form a pattern of expenditure that does not depend on visible work. To understand why this matters so much, it helps to return once more to the beginning of the human story, when energy management was shaped by landscapes rather than by prolonged suspension. Early human life involved uncertainty, but it was uncertainty tied to terrain, weather, daylight, and the physical presence or absence of others, animals, shelter, and food. A body moving through such a world prepared constantly, but the preparation was usually tethered to the next step in a real sequence. If water had to be found, the body oriented toward movement. If cold arrived, the body moved toward warmth, covering, or closeness. If danger seemed near, readiness led to vigilance, retreat, silence, or group coordination. The body did not simply gather itself and remain gathered for endless stretches. It was guided by outcomes. Even when outcomes were difficult, they still had shape. In contrast, the modern body may enter readiness many times without receiving that shaping movement toward completion. It prepares in small doses, often in response to conditions that are not physically resolved. This changes the nature of tiredness itself. Fatigue no longer reflects only what the body has done in the world. It also reflects what the body is quietly prepared to do and never discharged. That undischarged readiness carries a cost because the systems involved do not fully stand down. The muscles may not strain, yet they do not always soften completely. The breath may not quicken sharply, yet it may never quite sink into the slower rhythm of full release. The mind may not feel overtly distressed, yet it continues to hold slight anticipations, slight reservations, slight unfinished turns of attention. All of this creates internal movement without external motion, and internal movement still requires energy. This is one reason why rest can feel oddly ineffective when a person tries to recover simply by reducing activity. Less action is not always enough if the body continues to maintain readiness beneath the surface. The deeper human pattern required not only pause, but also the sense that a prepared state had found its end. In earlier environments, that ending was often easier for the body to recognize because the world changed in ways the body could trust. The task was done. The fire was lit. The group had stopped walking. Night had clearly arrived. The body could read those conditions and allow itself to descend into a different mode. In modern life, such endings are often weaker, and so the body remains partly assembled even in moments of stillness. This is why the drained feeling can seem so unfair. From the outside, there was no great effort, but from the inside, there may have been hours of quiet organization, held in reserve, never fully used, never fully dismissed. Over time, that reserve stops feeling temporary and starts becoming a way of being. The body keeps itself prepared for a world that no longer gives clear release, and the cost of that preparation slowly appears as exhaustion without a story, depletion without a visible struggle, and a form of tiredness that comes not from what the body has done, but from what it has been unable to stop getting ready for. When the body repeatedly prepares without arriving at full action, it begins to live in a pattern of interrupted expenditure, and this pattern may be one of the clearest explanations for why exhaustion can emerge even when life appears quiet from the outside. Energy is often imagined as something spent in visible bursts, through movement that can be measured and remembered, but the body does not organize itself so simply. It spends before action, during action, and also in the effort of holding action back while remaining ready for it. That third form of expenditure is easy to miss because it leaves so little external trace, yet it may become one of the most continuous drains in modern life. In earlier human settings, this hidden cost existed, but it was usually brief because readiness tended to move towards some definite outcome. A person heard something in the distance and either ignored it after further listening, moved toward others, changed direction, or prepared more fully. A person sensed cold and sought cover, fire, or bodily closeness. A person anticipated hunger and began searching, carrying, scraping, digging, gathering, preparing. The body's adjustments were not separate from the world. They belonged to sequences that led somewhere. This is important because the body was shaped not only to respond, but to resolve. Preparation made sense because it could be discharged into action or softened by a clear enough end. What becomes unusual in modern conditions is that the body can remain in a partially assembled state for long periods while nothing decisive happens. It holds posture, sustains attention, maintains subtle muscular tone, keeps breathing slightly tuned to expectation, and continues countless internal adjustments, all without the fuller movement that would once have completed the sequence. This creates a quiet imbalance between what the body is preparing for and what the world actually asks it to do. Looking back again toward the origins of human life helps make the problem more legible. Early humans lived inside environments where preparation was physically tethered to terrain, weather, daylight, group movement, food access, and shelter. Even uncertainty had texture. It belonged to tracks on the ground, sounds in the dark, changes in wind, movement at the edge of sight, or the practical needs of a camp or temporary resting place. The body learned to prepare in relation to such conditions because they usually developed into something that could be acted upon or dismissed. In other words, the body's readiness once had a better chance of finding a natural endpoint. In the present, many internal preparations remain suspended. The body begins to organize, but the action that would justify or complete that organization is delayed, fragmented, or unnecessary. Over time, this can make energy feel as though it is leaking through channels that the person cannot easily identify. The body is active, but the activity is internal and distributed. It is not the fatigue of walking a long distance, lifting weight, or enduring cold with the whole organism engaged in a single demand. It is the fatigue of many small preparations held open at once. Each one may be minor. Together, they become expensive. This helps explain why a person may finish an apparently undemanding day and still feel empty rather than restored. The body has not been idle. It has been maintaining a state of partial readiness across many hours, and partial readiness is inefficient when it becomes continuous. A body fully at work can eventually stop. A body fully at rest can eventually repair. A body held in between must do both badly. It neither spends decisively nor recovers completely. It remains in a middle condition where small amounts of energy are used to preserve availability, while deeper restoration is postponed. In earlier human worlds, that middle condition was less likely to become permanent because environmental signals more often forced a clear turn one way or the other. Day became night. The group moved or settled. The weather worsened or passed. The fire held or needed tending. The body could read those turning points and reorganize itself accordingly. In modern life, turning points are often weaker, and the body continues to carry readiness beyond the moment when it should have been released. This is where the drained feeling takes on its peculiar shape. It is not the result of doing nothing. It is the result of a body spending energy in preparation, withholding, adjustment, and incompletion, hour after hour, without the kind of outward sequence that makes expenditure feel justified or visible. Seen this way, the mismatch becomes harder to ignore. The body is not mysteriously tired. It is tired in a way that follows its own old logic, a logic built for a world where readiness usually led to action, and action usually led to some form of end. When that older logic is left unfinished too often, stillness itself begins to feel costly, and the person may experience exhaustion not because life demanded too much movement, but because the body never stopped quietly preparing for movement that never fully came. Even in complete physical stillness, the human body contains one organ that rarely becomes quiet in the same way as the muscles or the limbs, and that organ is the brain, which continues to use energy not only to respond to the world, but to anticipate it, to simulate it, and to hold patterns that may never become visible actions. This makes the question of fatigue more complex, because tiredness does not always belong to movement, but often to internal processes that remain active regardless of whether the body changes position or not. In earlier human environments, this constant activity of the brain was not separate from the physical world in which the body lived. Thought, perception, and action were tightly linked. To notice a change in the landscape was often to move in response to it. To remember the location of water or shelter was to guide the body through space. To anticipate danger was to prepare for immediate adjustment in behavior. The brain's work, though continuous, was closely tied to outcomes that could be acted upon, which meant that its activity was more often integrated into cycles that led somewhere and then concluded. When those cycles concluded, the overall system could shift toward recovery, not because the brain stopped working entirely, but because the conditions guiding its activity had changed in ways that allowed a different mode to emerge. In the present, that relationship becomes less direct. The brain continues to operate with the same fundamental capacities, but the environment it interacts with does not always require or allow the same kind of completion. It can generate patterns of thought, expectation, and simulation that do not lead to immediate action, and that do not resolve through clear external change. This does not mean the brain is malfunctioning. It means it is performing a type of work that is less visible and less easily discharged. Even in a quiet room, the brain may be organizing possibilities, recalling fragments, maintaining orientation in time, adjusting to subtle cues, and holding open lines of attention that never fully close. Each of these processes requires energy, and although the amount used at any single moment may not be large, the continuity of these processes creates a steady demand that the body must support. Looking back toward the early human context makes this continuity easier to understand. The brain evolved in conditions where its ongoing activity was anchored in immediate surroundings. To track movement in a forest, to remember paths across open land, to coordinate with others in a small group, to interpret changes in weather or light. All of these required continuous neural activity, but they also tended to lead toward physical outcomes. The brain was active, but its activity was not indefinitely suspended. It was part of a sequence that connected perception, anticipation, and movement. When movement ended, the nature of the brain's activity also shifted, guided by the same environmental cues that signaled rest to the body as a whole. In modern conditions, the brain often continues to operate at a level that resembles preparation, even when the body remains still. It may revisit possibilities that are not immediately acted upon, maintain awareness of tasks that are not currently being completed, or hold patterns that remain open without resolution. This creates a situation in which the most energy-demanding organ in the body continues to work in a diffuse and extended way, even during periods that are outwardly inactive. The result is a form of fatigue that does not match the visible simplicity of the moment. A person may feel tired after sitting quietly, not because sitting itself requires effort, but because the brain has remained active in ways that are not easily noticed. This is one reason why the experience of being drained can persist, even when physical demands are low. The body is supporting an internal activity that does not pause simply because movement has paused. Returning again to the earliest human environments highlights how different this pattern is from the one in which the brain originally developed. In a world where action and environment were closely linked, the brain's activity was shaped by signals that eventually changed, allowing it to shift along with the body. In a world where those signals are less clear, the brain may continue to hold itself in a mode of low-level engagement, and that engagement, carried across many hours, becomes a quiet but significant use of energy. Over time, this contributes to the feeling that energy has been spent without clear cause, because the expenditure has taken place within processes that do not produce visible movement or obvious results. The body appears at rest, but the brain remains at work, and the cost of that work is felt as a subtle but persistent depletion that is difficult to trace back to any single source. The brain does not wait for the body to move before it begins spending energy, because one of its oldest roles is not simply to react after something happens, but to remain quietly prepared for what might happen next. This makes human fatigue more difficult to interpret than it first appears. A person may judge the day by visible motion and conclude that very little has been done, yet beneath that still surface the brain may have remained active, almost without interruption, maintaining awareness, comparing possibilities, regulating inner balance, and continually shaping the body's readiness in ways that do not always become outward action. In earlier human environments, this constant activity had a tighter bond with the world outside the skin. The brain was busy because the surroundings required a living stream of interpretation. Shifts in sound, light, weather, animal movement, terrain, and social position all mattered directly. To notice was often to move, to remember was often to navigate, to anticipate was often to prepare for a change that would soon become physical and real. In that older pattern, the brain's energy use was not detached from action for very long. Its work belonged to sequences that could reach some kind of endpoint. A path was crossed, shelter was found, food was gathered or missed, night settled in. A threat either approached, vanished, or was answered by some adjustment in behavior. These endings mattered because they helped the whole organism shift state. The brain did not stop working, but its work changed character when the environment made clear that one condition had given way to another. In modern life, the brain still performs the same deep functions, but it often does so in conditions where the line between preparation and completion has become weaker. It continues to model possibilities, hold unfinished patterns, and maintain subtle orientation even when the body remains seated and the outside world appears quiet. This is not because the brain is overreacting in some dramatic sense. It is because the brain is built to keep track of what is pending, what is changing, and what might require response, and it can do this for long stretches without receiving the kind of clear resolution that earlier human environments more often provided. Looking back toward the beginning of human life helps make this more understandable. The brain evolved in bodies that moved through changing landscapes, within small groups, under shifting weather and light, where information usually arrived through direct sensory contact with the world. Memory, attention, and anticipation were essential, but they were usually tied to the next step in an unfolding sequence. The brain's activity was costly, yet it was often grounded. In the present, grounding is less reliable. The brain can remain occupied by patterns that do not become action and do not fade cleanly. It may keep returning to possibilities, maintaining a soft internal monitoring that never fully closes. This kind of work is easy to underestimate because it has no obvious sound, no clear visible strain, no physical trace equal to lifting, carrying, walking, or building. But the absence of visible strain does not mean the absence of demand. The body must continue supporting the brain while it holds these active patterns in place. Over time, this creates a form of tiredness that seems strangely disconnected from outward effort. A person may feel drained after long periods of apparent inactivity because the brain has been engaged in continuous internal labor, not in the loud form of crisis, but in the quieter form of ongoing organization. It regulates attention, moderates competing signals, keeps time, preserves orientation, and remains available for change. Returning once more to early human conditions sharpens the contrast. In those environments, the brain's constant activity was guided by a world that more often forced transitions the body could trust. Morning became day, movement became arrival, hunger became eating or continued searching, and darkness changed the meaning of space itself. The brain was active within rhythms that did not depend entirely on internal management. In modern settings, that burden shifts inward. The brain must continue much of its organizing work without the same environmental cues to help it stand down. This makes stillness less restful than it appears, because the most expensive organ in the body may remain quietly occupied even while the limbs are still. The result is not a dramatic collapse, but a slow thinning of energy, a feeling that the body has paid a cost without remembering exactly where the cost was incurred. Seen this way, the question is no longer why tiredness appears without effort, but how much invisible effort the brain can perform before the body begins to feel the weight of work that never became movement and never found a clear end. When the brain continues to operate in this ongoing, preparatory way without clear resolution, the body begins to experience a kind of fatigue that does not follow the familiar pattern of effort and recovery, but instead builds slowly through continuous internal activity that never fully settles. This form of tiredness is not sharp, and it does not point to a single moment of strain. It accumulates across time, shaped by the persistence of processes that remain active beneath awareness. The brain keeps organizing, predicting, maintaining orientation, and holding open possibilities, and although each of these tasks may seem small, together they form a steady demand that the body must support. The result is a quiet depletion that can feel disconnected from what has been visibly done. To understand why this happens, it is useful to return again to the conditions under which the human brain first developed its patterns of activity. Early humans lived in environments where the brain's constant work was closely tied to immediate sensory information. The landscape, the weather, the presence of others, the availability of resources, and the rhythms of day and night all provided signals that shaped attention and expectation. The brain was active because the world required it to be, but that activity was usually guided toward outcomes that could be recognized. A path was followed, a shelter was reached, a source of water was found or missed. Darkness arrived and changed the meaning of movement. Even when uncertainty remained, it was anchored in a physical setting that eventually shifted. Because of this, the brain's activity, though continuous, was more often part of cycles that led somewhere and then changed state. In the present, those cycles are less clearly defined. The brain continues to perform its organizing functions, but it does so in an environment that does not always provide the same kind of closure. It may hold patterns open for long periods, returning to them, adjusting them, and maintaining them, without a clear signal that they can be released. This does not require intense concentration or strong emotion. It can occur quietly, as a background condition in which the brain remains partially engaged, even when nothing urgent is happening. Over time, this partial engagement becomes costly. The brain is one of the most energy-demanding organs in the body, and its continuous activity requires a steady supply of resources. When that activity does not move toward resolution, it continues to draw on those resources without leading to a clear sense of completion. The body experiences this as fatigue, but it is a fatigue that does not match the visible simplicity of the situation. A person may sit, rest, or remain still, and yet feel as though energy has been used. This is not an illusion. It reflects the reality that internal work has taken place. Looking again toward early human life helps clarify the difference. In those settings, the brain's work was not only continuous, but also grounded in cycles that were supported by the environment. The transition from light to darkness, from movement to pause, from searching to finding, all provided signals that helped the brain shift its mode of operation. These signals did not eliminate the brain's activity, but they changed its character, allowing it to move from preparation toward recovery. In modern conditions, that shift is less reliable. The brain may remain in a mode that resembles preparation even during times that appear restful. It continues to hold open possibilities, maintain awareness, and regulate internal states without receiving the external confirmation that would allow it to stand down more completely. This creates a situation in which the brain is always slightly at work, even in moments that should allow deeper rest. The body supports this ongoing activity, and over time, the cost becomes noticeable. The feeling of being drained emerges not from a single source, but from the accumulation of many small expenditures that never fully resolve. This helps explain why rest can sometimes feel ineffective. The body is still, but the brain has not fully changed its state. It continues to operate in a way that belongs to preparation rather than recovery, and as a result, the deeper layers of restoration remain out of reach. Seen from this perspective, the experience of being tired without doing anything is not a contradiction. It is the outcome of a system in which the most energy-demanding organ remains quietly active, carrying out work that does not always lead to visible results and does not always receive the clear signals it needs to stop. Over time, this pattern reshapes how energy is felt, making fatigue appear in places where effort seems absent, and revealing that the boundary between activity and rest is not defined only by movement, but by whether the brain has been allowed to complete the processes it has begun. There is a particular kind of signal the human body does not easily ignore, and it is not always a signal of danger or pain, but a signal that something has begun and has not yet been completed. A condition that can quietly hold the system in place long after the initial moment has passed. These unfinished signals do not always appear as strong thoughts or clear tasks. Often they exist as faint impressions, partial intentions, or subtle shifts in attention that never fully close. The body, however, does not treat them as neutral. It registers them as open processes, and open processes tend to keep internal systems slightly active, as if waiting for a conclusion that has not yet arrived. In earlier human environments, this kind of unfinished state was less likely to persist for long without change, because the surrounding world itself provided resolution. A sound that drew attention would either reveal its source or fade into silence. A movement in the distance would become clearer or disappear. A need for food would lead to searching, and that search would end in finding, sharing, or continuing the attempt in a different way. Even uncertainty tended to move towards some form of outcome, and because it did, the body could release the state associated with it. The signal was not held open indefinitely. In contrast, modern conditions often allow signals to remain incomplete without forcing a clear ending. A person may begin to consider something, shift attention toward it, and then move away before any resolution occurs, leaving a trace of that beginning behind. This can happen repeatedly, creating layers of unfinished processes that remain active at a low level. Each one may be small, but together they form a network of open loops that the body continues to track. The brain does not simply discard these loops. It maintains a form of quiet monitoring, holding them in a state that is neither fully active nor fully dismissed. This state requires energy, not in large bursts, but in continuous subtle adjustments that keep the system oriented toward what has not yet been resolved. Looking back toward early human life helps make this pattern more understandable. For people living close to the immediate demands of the environment, beginning and ending were more closely tied. A task started because it was needed, and it continued until it reached a natural stopping point. Even when tasks were interrupted, the reasons for interruption were usually clear, and the body could shift to a new demand with a sense that the previous one had been set aside by necessity. The environment itself helped organize these transitions. In modern life, the organization becomes less external and more internal. The body begins processes in response to signals that are not always grounded in immediate physical outcomes, and those processes may remain open without clear boundaries. This creates a form of internal accumulation. The body is not only responding to what is present, but also carrying what has not been finished. Over time, this accumulation becomes costly. Each open loop requires a small amount of attention, a small adjustment in readiness, a slight holding of energy that cannot be fully released because the process it belongs to has not been closed. The result is a state in which the body is continuously managing incomplete signals. This does not produce a dramatic sense of overload. It produces a quiet, persistent background activity that is easy to overlook but difficult to escape. The feeling of being drained begins to emerge from this accumulation, not because any single signal is strong, but because many small signals remain unresolved at the same time. Returning again to the earliest human conditions highlights how different this is from the pattern the body originally adapted to. In those environments, the flow of events tended to move toward resolution, guided by changes in light, weather, movement, and the immediate needs of survival. The body learned to respond within that flow, not to remain indefinitely in a state of partial engagement. When the flow becomes less defined, the body must carry more of the process internally, and this increases the amount of ongoing work it must perform. The paradox of feeling tired while doing nothing begins to take on another layer here. The body is not idle. It is holding multiple beginnings without endings, and that holding requires energy. It is a form of work that does not leave visible marks, but that gradually shapes how energy is experienced. The question is no longer only about what the body has done, but about what it continues to hold open, and how long it has been waiting for signals that may never fully resolve. When several of these unfinished signals remain active at once, the body begins to distribute its attention across them in a way that is both subtle and continuous, and this distribution itself becomes a source of fatigue that is difficult to recognize. Each open loop does not demand full focus, yet none of them disappears completely, and so the system divides itself into small portions of readiness that remain gently active across many directions at the same time. This is not a state of confusion or disorder, but a state of quiet allocation, where the body keeps small amounts of energy attached to multiple beginnings that have not yet reached an end. In earlier human environments, this kind of divided holding would have been less common or shorter in duration, because most signals that drew attention were tied to conditions that evolved into something clearer. A movement in the landscape would either approach, resolve into something known, or fade away. A need would lead toward action, and that action would eventually produce an outcome. The body did not need to hold many threads open indefinitely, because the environment itself tended to close them through change. Even when life was uncertain, the uncertainty belonged to a world that continued to move, and in moving, it clarified what required attention and what could be released. In contrast, modern conditions often allow many small beginnings to coexist without forcing a conclusion for any of them. The body responds by maintaining a distributed form of readiness, holding each thread lightly but persistently. This creates a pattern in which attention is never fully gathered into a single resolved direction, nor fully released into rest. Instead, it remains spread out, like a surface under gentle tension. From the outside, nothing appears to be happening, yet internally the system is engaged in a continuous balancing act, keeping track of what has been started and what remains unfinished. This balancing act requires energy, not in sharp bursts, but in steady maintenance. The brain continues to monitor, the body continues to adjust, and the overall system remains organized around possibilities that are not fully realized. Over time, this distributed activity becomes one of the quieter forms of expenditure that shape how fatigue is felt. It does not create the clear sensation of effort that follows physical work, but it does reduce the depth of recovery that the body can achieve. The organism is never entirely free of pending processes, and so it never fully descends into a state where those processes can be released. Looking again toward early human life helps clarify why this matters. In those settings, the number of simultaneous unresolved demands was often limited by the structure of the environment itself. A person could not track an unlimited number of abstract possibilities at once, because attention was guided by immediate sensory conditions. The body responded to what was present, and what was present tended to move toward resolution. The system was not free from complexity, but it was grounded in a flow that prevented indefinite accumulation. In the present, that grounding is weaker. The body can maintain many open loops at once, each one small, each one persistent, and together they form a background that the system continues to manage. This background is not loud, but it is constant. It shapes posture, breathing, attention, and internal timing in ways that are difficult to observe directly. The result is a form of tiredness that does not correspond to a single demand, but to the accumulation of many small demands that have never been closed. This helps explain why rest can feel incomplete even when time has been set aside for it. The body is not only resting from what has been done, it is also carrying what has not been finished. Until those open loops are resolved or released, the system remains partially engaged, and partial engagement prevents full recovery. Seen in this way, the feeling of being drained is not simply the aftermath of action, but the consequence of a body that has been holding too many beginnings without endings. The energy is not lost in one place. It is dispersed across many small points of attention that continue to draw from the same limited reserve. As these open loops accumulate and remain distributed across the body's internal systems, something gradual begins to change in how the organism relates to rest itself, because rest is no longer simply the absence of action, but becomes dependent on whether these unfinished processes can settle enough to release their hold. When that release does not happen, even stillness carries a residue of engagement. The body may stop moving, the environment may grow quiet, yet the internal field remains lightly structured around what has not been completed. This creates a subtle but important shift. Rest becomes conditional rather than natural. It depends on the state of unresolved signals rather than on the presence or absence of activity alone. In earlier human environments, this condition was less likely to persist across long periods, because the flow of daily life tended to reduce the number of open loops by bringing them towards some form of closure. A task began and moved toward completion. A sound was investigated or dismissed. A need led to action that either resolved it or clearly postponed it. The body was not free from interruption, but interruption itself usually had a cause that the organism could register, and that cause often led to a new direction rather than an indefinite suspension. Because of this, the body could more often return to a state in which internal processes had fewer open edges. The system could settle not only because nothing was happening, but because what had been happening had reached a point where it no longer required holding. In contrast, when open loops remain active without clear resolution, the body carries a form of ongoing organization that does not fully dissolve during rest. It continues to maintain slight readiness across multiple points, keeping those beginnings available for return. This is not a conscious decision. It is a property of how the system preserves continuity. The brain keeps track of what has been started. The body holds subtle adjustments that correspond to those starts, and together they form a background structure that persists even in quiet moments. Over time, this persistence begins to shape the experience of fatigue in a more stable way. The person may feel that energy does not fully return, even after periods that appear restful. The body is paused in movement, but it is not paused in holding. The distinction is small, yet it carries a lasting effect. Energy that is used to maintain open loops is not available for deeper restoration, and so recovery becomes partial. This helps explain why the feeling of being drained can become chronic in a quiet way, without a single identifiable cause. The body is not reacting to a single event, but to a pattern of continuous, unresolved activity that has become part of its baseline. Returning once more to the earliest human context highlights how different this pattern is from the one the body was shaped within. Early humans lived in environments where the number of simultaneous unresolved demands was limited by what could be perceived and acted upon directly. The world itself filtered and resolved many signals through change. The body did not need to hold an indefinite number of open loops, because the environment kept moving toward outcomes that either required action or allowed release. In modern conditions, the filtering becomes weaker, and the body takes on a greater share of the work. It holds more beginnings, for longer, without the same degree of external closure. This increases the load on internal systems in a way that is steady rather than intense. The cost is not paid in moments of crisis, but across time, through the continuous effort of maintaining unresolved states. The result is a form of tiredness that is not easily relieved by simply stopping activity. The body is already still. What remains is the quiet labor of holding, and that labor does not end when movement ends. Seen from this perspective, the paradox deepens again. The body is not only tired from what it has done, nor only from what it is prepared to do, but also from what it continues to hold open without conclusion. This holding becomes one of the least visible yet most persistent sources of energy loss, shaping how rest is experienced and why it sometimes fails to restore what it once could. There is a difference between a body that is tired from what it has physically done and a body that is tired from what it has continuously processed. And the two forms of fatigue do not feel the same even when they are both real. Physical fatigue usually has a shape that the body can recognize. It follows movement, exertion, carrying, walking, lifting, building, resisting cold, enduring heat, or remaining active across changing terrain. It belongs to muscles, joints, breath, and the broader systems that support visible action. Because it follows action, it also tends to contain a clearer relationship to recovery. The body feels what was spent, and in many cases it can move toward repair in a way that feels direct. Cognitive fatigue is different. It is quieter, more diffused, and often harder to explain. It does not always leave the body sore, and it may arise even when movement has been minimal. It comes from sustained internal processing, from attention held too long, from low-level monitoring that does not resolve, from maintaining unfinished signals, comparing possibilities, preserving readiness, and organizing experience beneath the surface. This kind of tiredness can be more confusing because the person may look back over the day and find very little visible effort to account for it. Yet the body still feels reduced, dimmed, or emptied in some subtle way. To understand why this difference matters, it helps to return to the long beginning of human life, when these two forms of fatigue were more tightly joined than they often are now. In earlier human environments, thinking and moving were rarely as separated as they can become in modern life. Attention was tied to place. Memory was tied to paths, water sources, shelter, seasons, tools, and the habits of animals or the movements of other people. Perception did not usually remain abstract for long. To notice often meant to respond. To anticipate often meant to prepare for a real change in the body's position or behavior. In that setting, cognitive demand and physical demand often belong to the same sequence. A person tracked the sky, the ground, the group, and the terrain while also walking, carrying, gathering, watching, shaping, and enduring. The brain and the body work together inside one shared flow. This matters because when thought and movement remain linked, fatigue also carries a certain coherence. The body may be tired, but the tiredness belongs to a whole cycle of engagement with the world that can eventually give way to pause. In many modern conditions, that coherence weakens. The brain can remain highly engaged while the body remains nearly still. Attention can be sustained without movement. Possibilities can be held open without action. Signals can be tracked without reaching a clear outcome. The result is a form of fatigue that arises without the visible anchor of physical effort. The body is not walking across land, but the mind is still traversing possibilities. The hands are not building shelter, but the system is still maintaining unresolved patterns. The muscles are not carrying weight in a direct sense, yet the organism is still bearing something. This helps explain why cognitive fatigue can feel so strange. It draws from the same body that once spent energy in more unified ways, but now it does so through internal processes that often remain separate from movement and separate from completion. Looking again toward early human life helps clarify why this separation can be costly. For most of human existence, a tired mind and a tired body often arrive together because they arose from the same encounter with the world. A long walk, the search for food, the reading of weather, the tending of fire, the coordination with others, all drew on perception, memory, and action at once. Recovery, when it came, belonged to the whole organism. In contrast, modern cognitive fatigue can continue without that full organism cycle ever completing. The body remains inactive enough to appear rested, but the inner systems remain active enough to prevent deeper restoration. This creates a mismatch. Physical fatigue often asks for pause and repair. Cognitive fatigue, especially when it comes from unresolved internal activity, may persist even inside pause, because the processes creating it have not actually ended. That is why doing less does not always solve it. The body is not only recovering from effort, it is also carrying the residue of continuous inner work. Seen this way, the shift from physical fatigue to cognitive fatigue is not a minor difference in feeling, but a change in the structure of tiredness itself. One emerges from action that has happened. The other emerges from activity that keeps happening quietly, even when nothing outward seems to be taking place. And the body, which was shaped in a world where these forms of demand were more closely woven together, must now live with a kind of tiredness that it can feel deeply but cannot always locate clearly. Cognitive fatigue does not announce itself in the same way physical fatigue does, and this difference can make it more difficult for the body to respond appropriately, because the signals are quieter, less localized, and often spread across many small processes rather than concentrated in one place. A muscle that has been used heavily will eventually demand rest in a direct way. The sensation is specific, the cause is easier to trace, and the body can adjust by reducing movement or shifting position. Cognitive fatigue, by contrast, emerges from distributed activity. It does not belong to a single point in the body. It arises from sustained attention, subtle monitoring, unfinished signals, and the continuous background work of organizing experience. Because it is distributed, it can feel less urgent, but also less complete, as if the body cannot quite locate where the tiredness begins or ends. This has important consequences for how the body attempts to recover. When fatigue has a clear physical source, recovery can follow a recognizable pattern. The body reduces movement, increases stillness, and allows physiological processes of repair to take place. When fatigue is cognitive and unresolved, stillness alone may not provide the same result. The body can remain physically inactive while the internal processes that generated the fatigue continue without interruption. This creates a situation in which rest is attempted but not fully achieved. The person may sit or lie down, yet the system remains partially engaged, and the feeling of tiredness does not resolve in the expected way. Looking back toward early human conditions helps clarify why this distinction matters. In those environments, cognitive and physical demands were more closely aligned. Attention was required because movement was required. Memory was used because navigation through space depended on it. Anticipation served immediate bodily action. Even when the brain remained active, its activity was often integrated into tasks that had a beginning and an end. This integration meant that when the body stopped, the brain's activity also shifted in a coordinated way. The entire organism moved through phases together. In contrast, modern conditions often separate these phases. The brain may continue to process, organize, and maintain open loops long after the body has stopped moving. This separation creates a form of fatigue that is less responsive to simple rest. The body is still, but the source of the fatigue is not fully addressed by stillness alone. This is one reason why people sometimes feel tired even after periods of apparent rest. The internal activity has not changed state in the same way the body has. The organism remains partly engaged at a level that does not produce visible effort, yet still consumes energy. Over time, this can lead to a persistent sense of depletion that is difficult to resolve because the usual strategies for recovery do not fully match the source of the fatigue. Returning again to the earliest human environments highlights how unusual this situation is from an evolutionary perspective. The body was shaped in contexts where attention and action were rarely decoupled for long periods. The brain's work was tied to the body's movement through the world, and the end of action often signaled a shift in internal activity as well. This allowed recovery to be more complete because the entire system moved together into a different state. In modern life, that coordinated shift is less reliable. The body may enter a state of rest, but the brain may remain in a state of preparation or monitoring. This mismatch prevents the deeper layers of recovery from fully activating. The result is a form of tiredness that persists despite attempts to rest, because the underlying processes have not reached closure. This helps explain why cognitive fatigue can feel more elusive and more resistant to simple solutions than physical fatigue. It is not located in one place, and it is not resolved by a single change in behavior. It reflects a broader pattern in which the body and the brain are no longer moving through the same cycles at the same time. Seen from this perspective, the experience of being drained begins to take on a clearer structure. It is not only about how much energy has been used, but about whether the systems that used that energy have been allowed to complete their processes and shift into recovery. When that shift does not occur, the body remains partly engaged, and the feeling of tiredness continues, even in the absence of visible effort. As this quieter form of fatigue continues over time, the body begins to respond to it in ways that are not always helpful, because the signals it receives are unclear, and without clarity, the system may attempt to recover using patterns that were shaped for a different kind of tiredness. When physical fatigue is present, the body reduces movement, seeks stillness, and allows repair to occur through processes that follow a well-established sequence. But when cognitive fatigue is the primary source, reducing movement does not always address the underlying condition. The brain may continue its low-level activity, maintaining open loops, holding attention, and preserving readiness even as the body remains inactive. This creates a situation in which the usual pathway to recovery becomes less effective. The body rests, but the fatigue persists, and over time this can lead to a sense that rest itself is no longer working in the way it once did. To understand why this happens, it helps to return again to the early human context, where the patterns of fatigue and recovery were more closely aligned. In those environments, when a person became tired, the cause was often clear and the response was direct. After sustained movement, the body paused. After gathering or building, the body settled. After responding to environmental demands, the system shifted as a whole toward a different state. The brain and the body moved together through these phases, guided by changes in the world that made the transition unmistakable. This alignment allowed recovery to reach deeper levels because the entire organism was participating in the same shift. In contrast, when cognitive fatigue dominates, the body may enter stillness while the brain remains engaged in the patterns that created the fatigue in the first place. This creates a kind of split within the system. One part attempts to recover, while another part continues to work. The result is a form of rest that feels incomplete. The person may spend time without movement, yet still feel that something inside has not settled. This is not because the body is incapable of recovery, but because the conditions required for full recovery have not been met. The processes that need to end have not ended. Looking again toward early human life highlights how unusual this condition is. The environments in which the human organism developed rarely allowed for prolonged separation between mental and physical states. Attention was tied to action, and action led to outcomes that changed the conditions of the body. When those outcomes occurred, the system could reorganize. The brain did not need to maintain unresolved patterns for long periods without external change. In modern life, that external change is often less pronounced, and the brain must continue to manage internal activity without the same level of environmental guidance. This increases the likelihood that cognitive fatigue will persist even when physical demands are low. Over time, the body may begin to interpret this persistent fatigue as a general lack of energy, rather than as the result of specific unresolved processes. This can lead to patterns in which the person withdraws further from activity in an attempt to recover, yet the reduction in movement does not resolve the underlying condition. The brain continues its quiet work, and the cycle repeats. This does not mean that movement is always the solution, but it does suggest that the relationship between activity and recovery has become more complex. The body is no longer responding to a single type of demand. It is responding to a layered pattern in which internal and external processes are not fully aligned. Returning once more to the origins of human adaptation makes it clear that the organism was not designed for this kind of persistent separation. The systems that regulate energy, attention, and recovery evolved within a world where signals were clearer and transitions were more defined. When those signals weaken, the body must rely more heavily on internal regulation, and this increases the amount of continuous work it must perform. The feeling of being drained, then, is not simply a matter of how much has been done, but of how the body has been required to manage ongoing internal activity without the conditions needed to resolve it. This brings the distinction between physical and cognitive fatigue into sharper focus. One can be relieved by rest in the traditional sense. The other may require something more, not necessarily more effort, but a different kind of shift, one that allows the brain to move out of its preparatory state and into a mode where its activity can finally change. Until that shift occurs, the body may remain caught in a cycle where stillness does not restore and tiredness continues without a clear endpoint. The human body is not only shaped by what it does, but also by the structure of the environment in which those actions take place. And when that structure changes, the way energy is used and restored begins to change as well. In earlier human settings, the environment itself provided a kind of natural framework that guided when activity began and when it ended. Light shifted gradually across the day, temperature followed patterns that could be felt on the skin, and the demands of finding food, maintaining shelter, and staying close to others created rhythms that repeated with variation, but also with enough consistency for the body to recognize them. These rhythms did not make life easy, but they made it legible. The body could sense where it was in time and what was likely to follow, and this helped regulate the balance between readiness and rest. When a day moved toward evening, activity tended to narrow. When darkness arrived, the range of possible actions changed. When the group settled, the body received multiple signals that a transition had occurred. These environmental cues did not require interpretation. They acted directly on the organism, allowing internal systems to shift in response to external change. In this way, the body did not need to hold itself in a state of continuous decision-making about whether it should remain ready or begin to recover. The environment made that decision clearer. In modern conditions, this external structure becomes less distinct. The body still exists within cycles of light and darkness, but those cycles are often softened or extended in ways that reduce their clarity as signals. Activity can continue into times that would once have encouraged rest, and rest can occur in periods that are not strongly separated from activity. The result is a flattening of the boundaries that once helped the body move cleanly between different states. Without those boundaries, the body must rely more heavily on internal regulation to determine when to remain engaged and when to release. This internal regulation is possible, but it is also costly because it requires continuous monitoring rather than simple response to external cues. Over time, this shifts the burden of managing energy away from the environment and onto the organism itself. Looking back toward early human life makes this shift more visible. Number 6. For people living in close relationship with their surroundings, the day was not a continuous field of equal possibility. It was shaped by constraints that naturally organize behavior. Movement across land, the availability of resources, the presence of others, and the limits imposed by light and weather all contributed to a pattern in which activity had clearer edges. The body adapted to these edges, using them to guide transitions between effort and recovery. In contrast, when those edges become less defined, the body may remain in a more constant state of partial engagement. It does not receive the same strong signals that a phase has ended, and so it does not fully shift into the next phase. This creates a condition in which energy is used more evenly across time, rather than in distinct periods of expenditure followed by recovery. While this may seem efficient on the surface, it can actually reduce the depth of recovery, because the body is never fully released from its preparatory state. The feeling of being drained begins to emerge from this pattern, not because the body is doing more in a visible sense, but because it's doing something continuously without the benefit of clear transitions. This continuity prevents the system from fully resetting, and over time, it leads to a gradual depletion that is difficult to reverse through simple rest. The paradox becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. The body is not failing to conserve energy. It is operating within an environment that no longer provides the same structure for conserving and restoring energy in the way it once did. The organism continues to respond according to patterns shaped by earlier conditions, but those conditions have changed, and the mismatch creates a form of fatigue that is not tied to obvious effort. Instead, it is tied to the absence of clear beginnings and endings in the surrounding world. As long as the environment remains in this more continuous, less defined state, the body may continue to experience a kind of low-level expenditure that never fully resolves, and this becomes one of the deeper reasons why stillness can feel less restorative than expected. An environment that does not clearly end also does not clearly release the body from its state of readiness. And this may be one of the least visible but most persistent reasons energy feels thin even on quiet days. The human organism does not only respond to tasks, it responds to atmospheres, to patterns of space and time that tell it whether a phase is continuing or whether a phase has changed. In earlier human life, those patterns were often unmistakable. Morning light expanded the world and invited movement. Heat altered pace. Rain changed shelter and attention. Darkness narrowed what could be done and brought the group toward different forms of closeness, stillness, or watchfulness. The day was not a flat surface. It moved through recognizably different conditions, and those differences helped the body sort its own internal states. A person did not need to decide from within, moment by moment, whether activity should continue or whether recovery could begin. The environment participated in that decision. It signaled transitions through the most basic features of existence: light, temperature, distance, hunger, and the presence or absence of the group in a shared space. These signals were not gentle suggestions. They were embodied facts that changed behavior, and with behavior, changed physiology. Looking back toward those early settings helps clarify why the loss of such environmental endings matters so much. The body evolved within worlds where time was not experienced as a continuous stream of equally available hours. Instead, time had texture. Certain things belonged to dawn, others to midday, others to evening, and others to the narrow, uncertain interval after light had gone. The body learned to attach its own rhythms to these external sequences. It prepared when the world opened, and it released when the world closed. In contrast, a more continuous environment weakens those old cues. Activity can remain available without a strong change in atmosphere. Attention can remain lightly engaged because nothing in the surroundings insists that a transition has happened. The body continues on, not under intense demand, but under a prolonged absence of closure. This is important because the organism does not only need low effort to recover, it also needs contrast. It needs phases to feel different enough from one another that it can reorganize itself accordingly. Without contrast, recovery becomes shallow. The body remains near the surface of readiness because the world around it has not clearly shifted into something else. This creates a strange condition in which a person may spend long periods without obvious exertion, yet still not feel restored. The missing element is not inactivity. It is the environmental confirmation that inactivity belongs to a different phase with different rules. Returning again to the earliest human context makes this easier to see. A camp at dusk, a fire beginning to hold, the cold settling over the ground, the sounds of the wider landscape changing, the group drawing inward, all of these told the body that the terms of existence had changed for now. The body did not stop being vigilant in an absolute sense, but its vigilance changed form because the world itself had changed form. In modern conditions, that kind of deep transition is often weakened. 1 hour, and the next may differ very little in how they feel to the body. Space remains similar, light remains similar, sound remains similar. The atmosphere of possible action remains available. As a result, the organism receives fewer unmistakable messages that one state has ended and another has begun. Over time, this can produce a subtle but continuous expenditure. The body keeps itself slightly arranged for continuation. It stays available because the environment has not fully declared that availability is no longer needed. This availability does not always feel like stress. More often it feels like a quiet inability to sink fully into the moment, a sense that the day never really turned, that rest never became a different territory from activity. The cost of that continuity is paid gradually. The deeper layers of recovery rely on more than stillness. They rely on transition, on environmental contrast, on the body's ability to trust that it has entered a different phase of time. When that trust weakens, energy can continue draining in small amounts across many hours, not because the body is working hard in any visible way, but because it has not been clearly released from the expectation that something may still be required. Seen this way, the environment itself becomes part of the explanation for fatigue. The body is not only tired from what it carries inside, the environment. It is also tired from living in surroundings that no longer provide strong enough endings, and without endings, even calm can remain incomplete. When the environment loses its ability to mark clear endings, the body gradually stops expecting them, and this may be one of the deepest ways modern life reshapes fatigue. Without making that change easy to see, the human organism does not simply move through tasks one by one like a machine. It moves through phases of reality, and those phases once had strong borders. For most of human history, the world itself announced when a period of effort had narrowed, when movement had given way to shelter, when daylight had given way to caution, when the group had shifted from outward activity to inward stillness. These transitions were not ideas. They were conditions the body could feel directly in air, light, distance, sound, and temperature. Because they were direct, they helped the body do something essential. They helped it stop. Not stop in the absolute sense, because no organism ever becomes entirely inactive, but stop in the deeper biological sense of leaving one mode and entering another. This mattered because recovery depends not only on reduced demand, but on the confidence that demand has changed enough for internal systems to reorganize themselves. Looking back toward early human life makes this easier to understand. A body moving across land, gathering food, carrying materials, tending fire, or remaining close to others for safety, did not live in a seamless field of endless possibility. It lived in a world of transitions. Morning opened certain actions. Heat slowed others. Dusk compressed movement. Darkness altered the meaning of sound, distance, and exposure. The body learned these patterns over immense stretches of time, and it used them as external anchors for its own inner rhythms. In that older world, rest was not merely what happened when effort stopped. Rest was what happened when the world changed enough that the body trusted a different state was now appropriate. In modern conditions, that trust becomes harder to establish. The surroundings often remain too even, too continuous, too weak in contrast to tell the organism that a true shift has taken place. 1 hour may resemble the next too closely. A day may flatten into a long interior sameness where the body receives few unmistakable signals that activity has meaningfully ended. As a result, it continues holding a mild readiness beyond the point where earlier environments would have allowed release. This readiness does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, and that is what makes it powerful. What becomes ordinary can continue for years without being recognized as a source of fatigue. The body begins to live as if the world never fully closes. And if the world never fully closes, then the body never fully stands down. Over time, this changes the experience of stillness itself. Stillness no longer feels like a completed descent into recovery. It feels like a pause inside continuation. The person may be physically inactive, yet something in the organism remains arranged for the possibility that the phase has not truly changed. This is why quiet can still feel tiring. It is not empty. It is structured by a lingering expectation that the body has not been clearly released from. Returning again to the earliest human setting sharpens the contrast. A resting place at the edge of night, a fire established, bodies nearby, sound settling into familiar patterns. All of these gave the organism evidence that the terms of survival had shifted for now. The body could keep some degree of watchfulness while still allowing a deeper letting go. In a more continuous environment, that layered shift becomes harder. The body may remain suspended between modes, never pushed into full action, never welcomed into full release. This suspended state has a cost precisely because it is mild and prolonged. It does not demand attention in one sharp moment. It slowly erodes the depth of recovery across many ordinary hours. The result is a form of exhaustion that seems strangely out of proportion to visible effort, yet follows a coherent biological logic. The body is not confused in any random sense. It is responding to an environment that no longer offers strong enough endings for the rhythms it was shaped within. When endings weaken, transitions weaken. When transitions weaken, restoration weakens. And when restoration weakens for long enough, a person can begin to feel drained even in calm surroundings, not because nothing is happening, but because the body has been living too long in a world that no longer knows how to clearly say, for now, this part is over. Beneath all the more visible causes of fatigue lies a slower and older pattern, the rhythm by which the human body learned to expect activity, quiet, hunger, warmth, effort, and release across the span of a day and across the turning of seasons. The body is not only a collection of organs using energy in isolation, it is also a timing system, shaped over long periods by repeated exposure to regular change in light, temperature, food availability, social proximity, and the practical limits imposed by the natural world. In earlier human settings, these rhythms were not perfect, but they were strong enough to organize life in ways the body could anticipate. Morning did not feel like night. Cold seasons did not feel like warm ones. A group on the move did not feel like a group settling into shelter. These differences mattered because they gave the organism repeated, trustworthy cues about when to prepare, when to conserve, and when to recover. The body did not need to invent its own rhythm from within. Much of that rhythm came from the world outside, entering through the eyes, the skin, the gut, the muscles, and the shared timing of life with other people. Looking back toward the earliest human story helps make this clearer. For most of human existence, people lived close to the cycling of daylight and darkness. the uneven availability of food, the cooling of evening air, the warming of the sun, and the recurring demands of movement through landscape. These were not small background details. They formed the structure in which metabolism, attention, and rest were coordinated. When light faded, the body received a broad signal that a change in state was appropriate. When the group paused after movement or after the task that kept it alive, the body could interpret that pause within a larger rhythm that made sense. Recovery was not only about stopping work, it was about stopping at a time and in a context that matched the organism's expectations. In more modern conditions, those rhythms become weaker, flatter, or less dependable. The body still contains the old timing systems, but the surrounding world no longer supports them with the same clarity. Light may no longer signal the end of activity strongly enough. Meals may no longer arrive within older patterns of effort and release. Quiet and noise may not follow a predictable arc. Space may remain similar across hours that once would have felt sharply different. As a result, the body receives fewer of the broad, repeated cues that help it distinguish one phase of existence from another. This does not create immediate collapse. More often, it creates a subtle form of internal uncertainty. The organism keeps going, but it does so without the full strength of the rhythms that once guided its energy use. Over time, this weakens the body's ability to move cleanly into restoration. Rest still happens, but it may happen on a shallower surface. The body pauses without fully trusting the pause. It remains partly arranged for continuation because the surrounding cues have not strongly confirmed that the phase has changed. This helps explain why a person may feel drained even on days of limited visible effort. The issue is not always that too much energy has been spent in a single obvious way. Sometimes the issue is that the body has lost the deeper rhythmic support that allows energy to be spent and restored in a clear pattern. Returning again to earlier human life sharpens the contrast. A person living in close contact with changing weather, daylight, terrain, and group timing did not need to consciously manage every transition. The world carried part of that burden. The body could entrain itself to repeated signals that were stronger than any one thought or task. In the absence of those signals, the burden shifts inward. The body must regulate itself more actively, and active regulation is more costly than being guided by a world that already contains strong rhythms. This cost is rarely dramatic, but it accumulates. It appears as shallow recovery, blurred transitions, and the odd feeling that inactivity has not produced renewal. In this sense, fatigue is not only a matter of effort, or even unresolved signals. It is also a matter of lost timing, a body still built for rhythms that are now less visible, less stable, and less able to carry it gently from one state into another. When those rhythms weaken, the body does not immediately fail, but it does lose one of its oldest forms of guidance, and without that guidance, energy begins to feel harder to recover, even in stillness. When the body loses the strength of its older rhythms, fatigue becomes more difficult to interpret because energy is no longer moving through a pattern that feels distinctly ordered. In earlier human environments, the organism did not simply react to isolated events. It lived inside recurring cycles that gave shape to effort and recovery, before any conscious interpretation was needed. The gradual rise and fall of light, the cooling of evening air, the recurring presence or absence of food, the shared timing of movement and pause within a group, and the larger turn of seasons all helped the body know what kind of state it was in. These signals did not remove hardship, but they provided structure. A body waking in dim early light, moving through open ground, responding to temperature, hunger, and the pace of others, was not inventing its own rhythm from nothing. It was entering a pattern already written into the day. This mattered because the body's internal systems are not only mechanisms of response, they are also mechanisms of timing. They depend on repeated cues to know when to prepare, when to conserve, and when to release. Looking back toward the deeper human past makes this especially clear. For most of human history, daily life unfolded within conditions that changed in ways the body could trust. Morning and evening did not merely differ in brightness. They differed in what was possible, what was safe, and what kinds of action made sense. Seasons did not merely alter the scenery. They changed movement, shelter, food patterns, and the demands placed on the group. In that world, the body learned to associate its own shifts in energy with changes in the environment that arrived again and again. The rhythm was never perfect, but it was strong enough to guide physiology toward recognizable phases. When those guiding phases weaken, the body does not immediately stop functioning, but it loses a deeper kind of support. It must regulate itself with less help from the world outside. In modern conditions, this weakening of rhythm often happens quietly. The organism may still encounter light and darkness, but not in ways that clearly organize the day. Warmth and shelter may remain more constant across time. Meals may no longer follow the older sequence of effort, delay, and resolution. Hours may begin to resemble one another too closely. The result is not simply that the body becomes confused, but that it is left with fewer external anchors to help it move fully from one state into the next. Without those anchors, the system remains more self-managed, and self-management is costly when it must continue without strong environmental guidance. Over time, the body begins to live in a flatter temporal landscape, where activity and recovery are less clearly separated. This flattening matters because restoration depends on contrast. The organism needs not only less demand, but also a clear sense that the phase of demand has changed. In earlier human settings, that sense came from the world as much as from the body itself. The dimming of light, the change in temperature, the slowing of movement, the nearness of others in shared shelter, all helped signal that a different mode was now appropriate. In modern settings, when those contrasts weaken, the body may remain close to the surface of readiness even when outward life appears calm. It pauses, but it does not fully descend. It becomes still, but it does not completely trust the stillness. Returning again to early human life helps sharpen the contrast. A body shaped by long cycles of movement, settlement, wakefulness, darkness, hunger, and collective timing expects transitions to have a physical texture. It expects time to feel different as it changes. When time loses that texture, the body must keep more of its organizing work inside itself. This is one reason why fatigue can feel so persistent even without obvious effort. The organism is not only tired from what it has done, it is tired from living without the full rhythmic guidance that once helped expenditure lead naturally toward recovery. The drained feeling begins to make more sense here. It is not simply the result of too much work, nor only of unfinished signals held open inside the mind. It is also the result of a body trying to maintain balance in a world where the older pattern of rise, pause, and release has become less pronounced. Without strong rhythm, the body spends energy more diffusely and recovers less deeply. And when that happens for long enough, even quiet days can leave behind the feeling that something essential has not been restored, as though the body has rested in time, but not fully rested within the deeper sequence it was built to follow. As the body spends more time without the guidance of strong natural rhythms, it begins to lose not only a pattern of timing, but a pattern of trust. Because rhythm does more than organize the day. It tells the organism when a change in state is real enough to follow. In earlier human life, this trust was built slowly and repeatedly through a world that changed in ways the body could feel without effort. Morning light widened the landscape. Midday heat altered movement. Evening cold gathered around exposed skin. Darkness reduced what could be seen and changed how far one could move with safety. Hunger rose and fell within the practical limits of effort, place, and season. The presence of others, the use of fire, the shift from travel to stillness, all of these gave the body evidence that time was not abstract, but embodied. The organism did not need to decide from within whether one phase had ended and another had begun. The world itself carried that message. Because of this, recovery was not merely a private event happening inside isolated organs. It was part of a larger sequence in which the body could entrain itself to repeating changes outside the skin. Looking back toward the beginning of human history makes clear how important this older arrangement was. For most of the human story, people lived inside environments where the transitions of the day and the year imposed real consequences. The difference between light and dark was not symbolic. It affected movement, visibility, warmth, danger, and social closeness. Seasonal change did not simply alter scenery. It changed food patterns, distance traveled, shelter needs, and the rhythm of collective life. The body learned to read these shifts as reliable markers, and over long periods this gave human physiology something essential, a repeated confirmation that effort belonged to certain phases and release belong to others. When that confirmation weakens, the body does not entirely forget its older timing, but it loses the strength of the signals that once helped anchor it. This creates a subtle but lasting instability. The organism continues through the day, but it no longer receives the same depth of environmental support for shifting cleanly between readiness and restoration. Hours begin to resemble one another too closely. A period of quiet may not feel biologically distinct from a period of low activity. The body pauses, but the pause is not strongly set apart. As a result, recovery can begin and yet remain incomplete, because the body has not fully trusted that a different state has truly arrived. This is one of the quietest ways fatigue becomes chronic. It is not always born from overexertion, and not only from open loops or low-level alertness, though those still matter. It also emerges from living too long without strong temporal contrast, without enough reliable transitions to tell the organism that expenditure can now give way to repair. Returning again to early human life helps sharpen this point. A person sitting near shelter as darkness deepened, with the air cooling, the tasks of the day narrowing, and the group drawing nearer into a shared resting place, occupied a world that spoke clearly to the body. The body could still remain watchful, but its watchfulness belonged to a different phase, one shaped by the world's own descent into night. In a flatter environment, where external change feels weaker, the organism must generate more of that transition from within. But internally generated transition is rarely as convincing as one reinforced by the whole surrounding world. The burden of timing shifts inward, and with that shift comes effort. Not sharp effort, but continuous regulation. The quiet work of trying to manage energy without the older cues that once did part of that work for us. Over time, this weakens the depth of restoration. The body may rest in a practical sense, yet not fully recover in a rhythmic sense. That distinction explains why drained can feel like the right word even when nothing dramatic has happened. The person is not only tired from what was done, the body is also tired from having to carry its own rhythm in a world that no longer helps as much to set it. Seen this way, the loss of natural timing is not a small background detail. It is one of the deeper reasons stillness can fail to restore, because without rhythm, rest becomes harder for the body to believe in, and what the body cannot fully believe, it cannot fully enter. To understand why one generation may feel energy differently from another, it is not necessary to assume that the human body has fundamentally changed in only a few decades, because the deeper structure of the organism remains far older than any recent period. What changes more quickly is the setting in which that organism learns to spend, conserve, and interpret its energy. The body is always developing within an environment, and that environment includes not only landscape, light, temperature, and food, but also rhythm, expectation, and the background pattern of what daily life feels like. In earlier human settings, a child entered a world where movement, rest, hunger, warmth, cold, and social timing were woven into a shared structure that the body gradually learned without needing to name it. The timing of waking and sleeping, the pace of group activity, the physical demands of ordinary tasks, and the clear distinctions between effort and pause all help shape how energy was felt across a lifetime. This does not mean earlier generations were less tired. It means the form of tiredness they knew was often anchored more directly in the conditions of life around them. A body that grows inside stronger environmental contrasts learns to interpret fatigue through those contrasts. When effort rises, it expects a phase of release to follow. When the day narrows, it expects the body to narrow with it. When movement belongs to survival or household labor, tiredness carries a visible story. Looking back toward the earlier human past makes this pattern even clearer. For most of human history, the young did not learn energy through abstract schedules or flattened time. They learned it through embodied sequence. They saw when others moved and when they settled. They felt the difference between cold morning ground and the relative warmth of gathered bodies near evening shelter. They learned, gradually, that the body had phases, and those phases were confirmed by the world around them. As generations passed through such conditions, the interpretation of fatigue remained tied to a broader ecology of timing. In more recent settings, what shifts is not the ancient design of the body, but the consistency of the signals surrounding it. Different generations can grow up with different textures of daily life, different patterns of light, activity, enclosure, interruption, and expectation. And those differences slowly shape what the body comes to treat as normal. A person raised inside weaker transitions may not experience energy as something that rises and falls in clearly marked phases. Instead, energy may come to feel flatter, more fragile, more easily drained by diffuse conditions that earlier environments would have helped organize more firmly. This does not mean one generation is weaker in any simple biological sense. It means the background conditions training the nervous system and the habits of attention may differ enough to alter how tiredness is perceived, carried, and recovered from. If the body is repeatedly exposed to environments where activity never fully ends and rest never fully begins, then across years it may become more familiar with partial engagement than with complete release. That familiarity matters. What feels ordinary to one generation may feel exhausting to another, not because the human species has rapidly transformed, but because the balance between external structure and internal regulation has shifted. Returning again to the deep human story helps prevent this idea from becoming too narrow. Human beings have always adapted across generations to differences in climate, settlement, food pattern, social organization, and material surroundings. The body is not fixed in one expression. It learns within limits. But those limits were shaped over immense stretches of time in worlds where daily life still offered stronger sensory contrast than many people experience now. When those contrasts fade, more of the work of organizing energy moves inward. One generation may inherit not a new body, but a body asked to perform more silent regulation than the one before it. This makes fatigue harder to read. It no longer arrives only after obvious labor or clear environmental strain. It can appear in calmer rooms, quieter days, and less visibly demanding lives because the background burden has shifted from outward exertion to inward management. Seen this way, generational change is not only about habits or attitude. It is also about what kinds of rhythms, transitions, and embodied expectations the body learns to trust while growing into the world. And if those trusted patterns become thinner from one generation to the next, then the experience of being drained may also change, becoming less dramatic, less traceable, and more constant, as though the body were carrying not a heavier load in the old sense, but a more continuous one. As these environmental patterns differ from one generation to the next, the body does not simply observe the change, it slowly internalizes it, shaping its expectations of effort and recovery in ways that feel natural to the person experiencing them. A child growing up within a particular structure of time and activity does not consciously learn that structure as something separate from the self. It becomes the background against which all sensations are interpreted. What counts as a full day, what counts as rest, what feels like the end of effort, and what feels like continuation are all quietly calibrated over years of repeated experience. In earlier human settings, this calibration was guided by stronger external contrasts. The body learned through repetition that certain phases of the day carried certain demands, and that those demands would eventually narrow or end. Movement had a place, and stillness had a place, and the transition between them was often supported by the world itself. This allowed the body to build a more stable expectation that energy would be spent and then restored within recognizable cycles. Looking back toward the deeper human past helps clarify how important this learning process was. Human beings did not inherit a fully formed sense of energy management at birth. They developed it through interaction with their surroundings, through watching others, through feeling the rhythm of shared activity, and through experiencing the physical limits imposed by light, weather, and available resources. Over time, this created a kind of embodied knowledge, a quiet understanding of when to push and when to release, not through abstract rules, but through lived repetition. In more modern conditions, the patterns that guide this learning become less distinct. A person may grow up in an environment where the boundaries between activity and rest are less clearly marked, where transitions are more subtle, and where the body must rely more on internal signals than on external cues. This does not prevent learning, but it changes the content of what is learned. Instead of developing a strong expectation of clear cycles, the body may become accustomed to continuity, to days that do not sharply divide into phases, to moments of rest that are not strongly differentiated from moments of low activity. Over time, this shapes how fatigue is interpreted. A person may come to expect that energy will feel uneven, that tiredness may appear without a clear cause, and that rest may not always lead to full recovery. These expectations are not necessarily conscious, but they influence how the body organizes its responses. Returning again to early human life highlights the contrast. In those settings, a child growing into adulthood would repeatedly encounter the same broad patterns of change. The sun would rise and set in ways that affected what could be done. The temperature would shift in ways that altered behavior. The group would move and settle according to needs that were physically grounded. These repeated experiences reinforce the body's ability to recognize phases and to move between them with a certain confidence. In modern environments, where these patterns are less pronounced, that confidence may not develop in the same way. The body still seeks rhythm, but it finds it in a world that offers weaker signals. As a result, more of the work of defining phases falls to internal processes. This increases the load on the organism in a subtle but continuous way. The body must decide, moment by moment, whether to remain engaged or to begin releasing, and this decision is rarely as clear as it once was when the environment provided stronger guidance. Over time, this can lead to a form of fatigue that is not tied to any single demand, but to the ongoing effort of managing energy without a stable external framework. The person may feel that something is missing, not in the sense of a specific need, but in the sense that the day never fully organizes itself into a pattern that allows deep recovery. Seen from this perspective, the differences between generations are not only differences in behavior or habit, they are differences in the underlying conditions that shape how the body learns to interpret and manage energy. Each generation inherits a similar biological structure, but that structure is trained within a different environment, and over time, those differences in training can produce noticeable changes in how fatigue is experienced. The body remains the same in its deeper design, but the way it moves through its own cycles can become less stable, more continuous, and more dependent on internal regulation, which in turn makes the experience of being drained more likely to appear even in the absence of visible effort. When these quieter patterns of life are repeated across years and then across generations, the result is not a sudden transformation of human biology, but a gradual shift in what kinds of fatigue feel normal, expected, and difficult to escape. The body remains recognizably human in the older sense. It still carries the long inheritance of movement, vigilance, rhythm, hunger, recovery, and adaptation shaped across vast periods of time. Yet what each generation learns to interpret as ordinary can differ greatly depending on the structure of the world that surrounds it. If one generation grows up inside stronger transitions, clearer boundaries, and more visible links between effort and release, then tiredness tends to arrive with a more legible story. The body knows, in a deeper embodied way, what it has spent and why it needs to recover. If another generation grows up in flatter conditions, where activity continues in softer forms and rest is less clearly separated from ongoing engagement, then fatigue may become harder to read. It may not feel like the aftermath of exertion. It may feel like a quiet reduction of energy that accompanies ordinary life itself. Looking back toward the early human story helps clarify why this difference matters. For most of human existence, a person growing into adulthood entered a world where timing, effort, and recovery were reinforced not only by the body but by the environment and by the group. A child did not simply learn when to rest by private feeling alone. Rest was embedded in collective rhythms, in changes in light, in shared movement, in the narrowing of activity at certain times and the broadening of it at others. Fatigue had context. It was not always easy, and life was certainly not gentle, but the body was trained within a world that made its own phases more visible. In such a setting, the interpretation of tiredness remained connected to events, places, and transitions that could be felt directly. In more modern conditions, the body may still learn rhythm, but it learns rhythm from a world with weaker contrast. One part of life can bleed into another. Quiet can contain continuation. Stillness can contain low-level preparation. Days can pass with few sharp boundaries between engagement and release. A body raised in such conditions may become highly practiced at living inside partial readiness. That practice can look like adaptation, and in one sense, it is. Human beings are capable of adapting to many kinds of environments, but adaptation has a cost when it requires the body to perform more of the organizing work internally than the surrounding world once helped to perform. Over time, one generation may come to inherit not a damaged body, but a body more accustomed to subtle, continuous regulation. This changes the feel of fatigue itself. Tiredness becomes less tied to obvious work and more tied to the atmosphere of living. It becomes easier to feel drained without a dramatic cause, harder to locate the source, and more difficult to trust that rest will fully restore what has been spent. Returning again to the deeper past keeps this idea grounded. The human organism was never designed for one perfect environment, but it was shaped in worlds where external conditions still provided strong help in sorting time, energy, and attention into phases. When that help weakens across generations, the burden does not vanish, it moves inward. Each body must do more silent work to decide when effort is continuing and when it is safe to release it. That silent work becomes part of what later generations experience as normal life. They may not feel that anything dramatic is wrong. They may simply feel that energy is harder to hold, that rest is less complete, that tiredness arrives sooner and stays longer than expected. Seen this way, generational drift in fatigue is not a story of sudden decline. It is a story of subtle recalibration. The body learns from the world it enters, and if the world offers fewer clear endings, weaker rhythms, and softer distinctions between effort and pause, then the body learns to live with a more continuous form of internal management. That management is quiet, but not free. It slowly shapes how energy is felt from childhood into adulthood, and from one generation into the next. This is why the modern experience of being drained can seem both personal and strangely widespread at the same time. It is not only about individual weakness or individual strain. It may also reflect a broader historical shift in the conditions under which human bodies learn, what it means to spend energy, what it means to recover it, and what it means to feel truly released from the need to remain prepared. What often appears as rest in modern life may not be rest in the deeper biological sense. And this distinction becomes clearer when we consider how the body recognizes recovery. The human organism does not measure rest only by the absence of movement. It measures it by a shift in internal state, a transition in which readiness gives way to release, and the systems that have been maintaining vigilance are allowed to stand down more fully. In earlier human environments, this shift was not something the body had to decide alone. It was supported by changes in the world that made the transition unmistakable. The dimming of light, the cooling of air, the gathering of others, the reduction of available tasks, all worked together to signal that a different mode of existence had begun. In such conditions, stillness was rarely isolated from context. It belonged to a broader change in the environment, and because of that, the body could recognize it as genuine rest. Looking back toward early human life helps clarify why this matters so much. A person settling near shelter at the edge of night, with the sounds of the surrounding landscape shifting and the demands of movement narrowing, was not simply choosing to stop. The world itself was narrowing with them. The range of possible action had changed. The body could feel that change through multiple senses at once, and that sensory confirmation allowed internal systems to reorganize in a deeper way. Muscles could soften more completely. Breathing could settle into a slower rhythm. Attention could withdraw from the wide field of possibilities that daylight had required. Even vigilance, though never entirely absent, took on a different form, one that did not require the same continuous readiness for movement. In contrast, many forms of modern rest occur in conditions that do not provide such strong environmental support. A person may stop moving, but the surrounding world does not clearly shift with them. The space remains similar, the light may remain steady, the atmosphere of possible activity may continue without strong interruption. As a result, the body receives fewer signals that a true transition has taken place. It pauses, but it does not fully change state. This creates a form of rest that is incomplete, not because the person is doing something wrong, but because the conditions that support full recovery are weaker. The body remains partly arranged for continuation, as if the phase of activity has not truly ended. This partial arrangement is subtle, but it carries a cost. Systems that should power down remain lightly active. Attention does not fully withdraw. The sense of readiness is reduced, but not released. Over time, this can make rest feel less effective. A person may spend long periods without movement and yet not feel restored, because the internal shift that defines deeper recovery has not occurred. Returning again to early human environments highlights how different this pattern is from the one the body evolved within. In those settings, rest was rarely a solitary event separated from the world. It was part of a shared rhythm, reinforced by changes in light, temperature, group behavior, and the limits imposed by the natural environment. The body did not need to question whether it was time to recover. The world answered that question clearly. In modern conditions, the answer is less clear, and so the body must interpret it more actively. This increases the amount of internal work required to achieve the same result. The organism must decide when to release readiness, and without strong external confirmation, it may choose to remain partially engaged. This is one reason why rest can feel like an effort rather than a natural descent. The body is not only stopping, it is also managing the uncertainty of whether stopping is truly appropriate. Seen from this perspective, the illusion of rest becomes easier to understand. Stillness can exist without recovery because recovery depends on more than stillness. It depends on the body's ability to trust that a phase has ended, and that trust is shaped not only by internal signals, but by the structure of the environment. When that structure becomes weaker, rest becomes shallower, and the feeling of being drained can persist even in moments that appear calm. The body is not resisting recovery, it is waiting for conditions that allow it to complete the transition it was shaped to make. The difference between stopping and restoring becomes even more important when the body begins to confuse inactivity with safety, because the two are not always the same in biological terms. A person can remain still while the organism continues to hold subtle forms of readiness, and when that happens, the body experiences a kind of suspended rest, a pause in movement without a full descent into recovery. In earlier human environments, this distinction was less likely to persist for long because stillness usually occurred inside conditions that also changed the body's deeper expectations. To stop near a fire at dusk, to settle into the protection of others, to feel the air cool and the landscape quiet, was not merely to reduce action. It was to enter a different state of the world, one that gave the body multiple reasons to release the wider readiness demanded by open daylight and active movement. The environment did part of the work. It helped turn stillness into restoration by making the transition unmistakable. Looking back toward those older conditions helps explain why modern rest can feel incomplete, even when it appears generous in terms of time. The body does not only ask, "Have I stopped?" It also asks, "Has the world changed enough for me to believe that stopping is now appropriate?" In early human life, that question was often answered directly by changes in light, sound, temperature, social position, and available action. The horizon of possibility narrowed. Certain tasks could no longer continue. The body did not need to hold itself equally prepared for all directions. It could settle into a mode shaped by the surrounding world. In modern conditions, however, stillness often arrives without that environmental narrowing. A person may sit quietly, yet the atmosphere around the body remains open, continuous, and lightly charged with possibility. The room may not feel different in any deep sensory way from the hours that came before. The body pauses, but it does not fully feel that it has entered a separate phase. As a result, many internal systems remain gently active. Posture stays slightly organized. Attention keeps a loose connection to pending signals. Breathing may remain more adjusted than released. The organism does not collapse into distress, but neither does it fully enter restoration. This is one reason why rest can feel thin. The body has been given time without having been given a complete transition. Returning again to the beginning of the human story sharpens this contrast. For most of human existence, rest was not something the body had to create out of neutral conditions. It emerged from a world that imposed rhythms and limits strong enough to change what rest actually was. A group returning to a temporary shelter, the dimming of available light, the redistribution of sound across open ground, the warmth of proximity and fire, all of these altered the body's relationship to space and time. Rest had texture. It had boundaries. It felt different from activity not only because movement had ceased, but because the terms of survival had shifted. In a flatter environment, where surrounding conditions do not clearly declare that a new phase has begun, the body must generate more of that shift from within. That internal generation is possible, but it is less convincing than a transition reinforced by the whole world around the organism. The body may therefore remain partly unconvinced. It becomes inactive without becoming deeply at ease. Over time, This creates the illusion that more time stopped should automatically lead to more recovery. But the body does not recover only by counting the absence of movement. It recovers by entering a different mode, and modes are not entered through stillness alone. They are entered through believable change. This helps explain why long periods of apparent rest can leave a person feeling oddly unchanged, as if the tiredness has simply waited underneath the pause and then returned in the same form. The pause was real, but the transition was incomplete. The body stood still while continuing to hold itself open to continuation. Seen in this way, modern rest can become deceptive. It resembles recovery from the outside, yet lacks some of the deeper cues that allow recovery to take hold. The result is not a failure of character or will. It is the understandable response of an organism that was shaped in environments where rest arrived with stronger sensory confirmation than many bodies receive now. When that confirmation weakens, the body may remain half inside effort even while appearing to be at rest, and the quiet exhaustion that follows is not imaginary. It is the cost of a pause that looked like release, but never fully became it. When this pattern continues for long enough, the body may begin to accept incomplete rest as if it were the normal form of recovery, and that acceptance can quietly reshape how energy is felt from day to day. The person may no longer expect rest to bring a clear sense of return. Instead, rest becomes a softer event, a period of reduced outward demand that still leaves some part of the organism arranged for continuation. This is one of the more subtle consequences of living in conditions where the signs of true transition have weakened. The body does not simply miss recovery once in a while. It gradually recalibrates around a shallower version of it. In earlier human environments, such recalibration would have been less likely to take hold in the same way, because rest was more often reinforced by the world itself. The close of day changed the field of possible action. Darkness, cooling air, altered sounds, the nearness of others, and the practical narrowing of movement all helped define a phase in which the body could shift its internal priorities. Even when danger was never entirely absent, the form of vigilance changed. It no longer belonged to wide movement across open terrain or active searching under full light. It belonged to a more bounded state, and that boundedness mattered. The organism could trust that the day had entered a different arrangement. Looking back toward those deeper human conditions helps explain why incomplete rest is so costly now. A body shaped over long stretches of time to recover within strong transitions does not easily thrive on pauses that lack convincing boundaries. It can function within them, but functioning is not the same as restoring. If the world around the body does not clearly reduce its horizon of demand, the body continues to keep small portions of itself prepared. Attention remains lightly extended. Muscles never fully lose their organizational tone. Breathing does not always deepen into the rhythm of full release. The system enters a reduced state of output, but not a fully reorganized state of repair. This is why the illusion of rest can persist for so long without solving the feeling of being drained. From the outside, enough time may seem to have passed. From the inside, the change may never have become real enough. Returning again to early human life sharpens this contrast. A resting place was not only a location, it was a change in sensory and social reality. The body near a settled fire, surrounded by familiar others, hearing the different soundscape of evening, feeling temperature drop and movement narrow, was receiving evidence from many directions at once that a different mode had begun. Rest did not depend on inner persuasion alone. The world joined in the act of lowering demand. In more modern settings, the body often receives far less of that support. 1 hour may blend into the next. A quiet period may remain embedded inside the same atmosphere of possible continuation. The body pauses, yet it still feels, however faintly, that it may need to resume at any moment. This weakens the depth of restoration and makes tiredness harder to discharge. Over time, the person may come to believe that rest itself has become unreliable, when what has actually become unreliable is the body's ability to recognize that rest is truly happening. This distinction matters because it shifts the question away from simple inactivity and toward the quality of transition. The body does not only need less to do, it needs a believable descent into another state. Without that descent, stillness remains shallow, and shallow stillness cannot fully repay the slow costs of low-level alertness, open loops, and internal preparation that have been accumulating beneath the surface. Seen this way, the illusion of rest is not a minor misunderstanding. It is a central feature of why exhaustion can persist in quiet lives. The organism stops moving, but never fully stops orienting. It enters pause, but not surrender. It receives time, but not enough of the old sensory evidence that time has changed its meaning. And when time changes its length without changing its biological texture, the body may remain tired not because recovery is impossible, but because what looked like recovery never became complete enough for the deeper work of restoration to begin. When all of these layers are brought together, a different picture of tiredness begins to form, one that does not depend on a single cause, but on the interaction between patterns that have slowly shifted away from the conditions the human body was shaped within. The organism has not lost its ability to manage energy, but it now does so in a setting that asks it to remain prepared more often, to carry more unfinished signals, to regulate itself without strong environmental transitions, and to rest in ways that do not always allow full release. None of these changes alone is enough to explain the feeling of being drained. Together, they begin to form a coherent structure. The body is not failing randomly. It is responding consistently to a world that has become quieter in some ways and more continuous in others. Looking back across the long span of human existence helps anchor this understanding. For most of that time, energy moved through clearer sequences. A need arose. The body prepared. Action followed. The outcome, whether successful or not, created a shift. The environment itself changed, and with it the internal state of the organism. Even when life was difficult, this pattern gave energy a direction. It was spent and then released, guided by signals that were repeated across days and seasons. In the present, that direction becomes less defined. The body still prepares, but preparation may not lead to action. Signals arise, but they may not resolve. The environment continues, but it does not always provide the same strong cues for transition. As a result, energy begins to move in a more diffused way, not concentrated in clear episodes of effort, but spread across many small processes that remain open. This diffusion is one of the reasons tiredness feels harder to trace. There is no single moment where everything was spent. There is a long accumulation of partial expenditures that never fully closed. Returning again to the earliest human context highlights how unusual this pattern is from an evolutionary perspective. The organism developed within landscapes that imposed limits. Light ended the day. Darkness changed movement. Cold and heat shaped behavior. Food was not continuously available, and its pursuit created distinct phases of activity and rest. These limits were not comfortable, but they were organizing. They helped the body know when to gather itself and when to release. In modern conditions, many of those limits are softened. The body gains certain forms of ease, but loses some of the structure that once guided its rhythms. The burden of organizing energy shifts inward, and that shift increases the amount of continuous work the organism must perform. Over time, this work becomes background. It is rarely noticed directly, but it shapes how energy is felt. The body may appear to do less, yet feel more drained, because the effort has moved from visible action to ongoing internal management. This understanding does not lead to a simple solution, because the conditions that create this pattern are woven into the broader structure of life. It does, however, clarify the nature of the experience. The feeling of being drained even when doing nothing is not without logic. It is the result of a body carrying multiple forms of incomplete work, of readiness that does not resolve, of rhythms that have weakened, and of rest that does not always reach its deeper form. Seen in this way, tiredness becomes less of a mystery and more of a reflection, not only of what the body has done, but of the conditions it has been living within. The question then shifts slightly. Instead of asking only why energy feels low, it begins to ask what kinds of patterns would allow energy to move again in clearer sequences, where preparation leads somewhere, where signals can close, where rest can deepen, and where the body can once again recognize, even briefly, that something has truly come to an end. If the body has been shaped by unresolved readiness, weakened rhythms, incomplete rest, and an environment that no longer provides strong enough endings, then the deeper question is not whether the body is broken, but whether it is still trying to follow an older logic inside conditions that no longer match it. This possibility matters because it changes the tone of the entire problem. A person who feels drained without obvious effort may begin to assume that something inside has failed, that energy has become unreliable for no reason, or that the body is somehow overreacting to ordinary life. But when we step back and look across the long history of human adaptation, another interpretation becomes possible. The body may not be malfunctioning in the simple sense. It may be doing exactly what it was shaped to do, preserving readiness when endings are unclear, maintaining internal organization when rhythms are weak, and refusing full release when the surrounding world does not convincingly change state. In earlier human conditions, this caution would often have been useful. A body that relaxed too quickly, that treated every pause as safety, or that ignored incomplete signals could have been placed at risk. The organism learned, over immense stretches of time, to trust certain patterns and remain careful in their absence. This does not mean earlier human life was more restful in an easy or romantic sense. It means the body's responses were more closely aligned with the structure of the world around it. A change in light meant something real. A drop in temperature meant something real. The gathering of others near shelter, the slowing of movement, the narrowing of available action, all of these gave the body evidence that one phase had ended and another had begun. In such a world, deeper release was not a private act of will. It was supported by sensory confirmation from many directions at once. Returning again to those older environments helps clarify the present paradox. The modern body often lives in surroundings that ask for less visible labor while providing less trustworthy closure. The organism receives fewer strong signals that a period of readiness can truly end, and so it continues to carry low, distributed forms of effort across time. These efforts are easy to overlook because they are internal. They involve monitoring, holding, adjusting, preparing, and maintaining unfinished states. None of them look like the hard physical work that earlier generations or earlier human communities would have recognized immediately as tiring. Yet together they create a different kind of load, one that is persistent precisely because it is made of many small parts rather than one large demand. This helps explain why the exhausted feeling can seem so disproportionate to what has outwardly happened. The body is not only measuring movement, it is measuring unresolved organization. It is measuring how long it has remained partially assembled for what never quite came, how long it has been without clear transition, and how often stillness has failed to become recovery. Seen this way, tiredness becomes less accusatory. It is no longer evidence that the body is weak or wasteful. It is evidence that the body still belongs in some deep way to a world of stronger contrasts, clearer sequences, and more trustworthy endings. The question that follows from this is not a narrow one. It is not simply how to have more energy. It is how a body shaped in one kind of time continues to live in another. That is a larger and quieter question, and it resists simple certainty. Human beings have always adapted, but adaptation does not erase older patterns all at once. Sometimes it leaves the organism living between logics, outwardly suited to one environment while inwardly responding to another. This may be one reason the feeling of being drained carries such a strange emotional quality. It often feels both personal and impersonal at the same time, as though something intimate is wrong, while also feeling too widespread to belong to one person alone. Perhaps that is because the feeling does not come only from individual strain, but from a more general mismatch between the body's ancient expectations and the softer, flatter continuity of the world now surrounding it. And if that is true, then fatigue may not be only a symptom to explain away, but also a signal. A quiet reminder that the human body still remembers forms of beginning and ending that modern life no longer offers so clearly, and that somewhere beneath the drained feeling is an older demand still waiting to be answered, not with force, but with a kind of pattern the organism can once again believe in. If there is a final thought to leave resting in the background, it may be this. The human body is not only a machine that spends energy, but a living memory of older conditions, still shaped by rhythms, closures, and transitions that were once easier to trust. Across the long stretch of human history, tiredness usually belonged to a world that had clearer edges. A day opened and closed with stronger differences. Effort was more visibly tied to movement, weather, hunger, shelter, and the needs of the group. Rest did not always mean comfort, but it more often meant entry into a different state that the whole environment confirmed. The body could feel when the air had changed, when the light had narrowed, when movement had ended, when others had gathered close, when the tasks of the day had reached a point where further action no longer made sense. In that kind of world, recovery was supported not only by what happened inside the organism, but by what the organism could trust outside itself. In quieter modern life, many of those outer conformations have grown weaker, and because they have grown weaker, the body must carry more of the burden alone. It must decide when to remain ready, when to soften, when to stop holding open unfinished signals, when to treat stillness as true recovery, rather than as a pause inside continuation. That extra burden is rarely dramatic, but it is constant enough to matter. It asks the body to manage what earlier environments more often helped organize. This is why exhaustion can appear in lives that look calm from the outside. The body may not be overrun by visible labor, yet it may still be carrying low-level alertness, partial preparation, weakened rhythms, incomplete endings, distributed cognitive effort, and forms of rest that never fully become release. When all of that is held together for long enough, the drained feeling becomes understandable. It is not an illusion, and it is not necessarily a personal failure. It is the quiet cost of a body still following ancient rules in a world that no longer presents those rules with the same clarity. This does not lead to a harsh conclusion. It leads instead to a gentler one. The body may deserve to be read with more patience than judgment, because what feels like weakness may actually be persistence. What feels like unreliability may actually be the body continuing to search for patterns of safety, timing, and closure that once came more naturally from the world around it. There is something quietly educational in that realization. It reminds us that human energy is not only about will, discipline, or visible effort. It is also about environment, sequence, and the deep biological need for beginnings that can finish. A person can appear to be doing very little and still be carrying many invisible forms of work. The body can remain loyal to unresolved signals long after the conscious mind has stopped noticing them. And rest can fail, not because rest is meaningless, but because the conditions that let rest become deep enough are no longer always present in ways the organism can believe. Seen from this wider angle, the feeling of being drained even when doing nothing becomes less mysterious and more human. It belongs to a species that did not emerge in flat time, in endless continuity, or in environments where every hour resembled the next. It belongs to a body that learned itself through contrast, through the clear architecture of effort and release, through the repeating promise that after one phase ended, another truly began. Perhaps that is why the question remains open even at the end. Not because there is no explanation, but because the explanation leads beyond one symptom and into a larger reflection on what kind of world the human body still expects to inhabit. And if the body continues to feel tired in the silence between obvious tasks, perhaps the deepest question is not only what energy has been lost, but what ancient form of ending, rhythm, or release the body is still quietly waiting to recognize.